Over the years of being an atheist and a libertarian, arguing with theists and statists alike, I keep getting slapped in the face with these incredible similarities between the atheist and libertarian positions, and the fallacies of theism and statism. I know some of you who watch my videos are atheists but statists as well, and others are libertarians but theists as well. In this series, I hope to show that the reasons atheists have for rejecting the God hypothesis are remarkably similar to the reasons libertarians have for rejecting the government hypothesis, so that if you're an atheist, maybe you'll become a little more libertarian. And if you're libertarian, maybe you'll come a little closer to atheism, at least close enough to see where we're coming from. In this first video, we'll look at the basics of what it means to be an atheist and a libertarian, and talk about the position being taken and the concept of burden of proof. It's all based on the fact that both atheism and libertarianism are negative philosophies. Now, I don't mean negative as in,
"Oh, don't be so negative."
I mean negative in the sense as it's used in logic. They both negate propositions, whereas a positive philosophy posits propositions of its own. It's the positive claim that bears the burden of proof. So let's start with atheism. According to dictionary.com, the prefix a means variant of an before a consonant, meaning not, without, amoral, atonal, achromatic. Theism is a belief in God, so atheism means not believing in God or without a belief in God. Note that this is not positing any claim of its own. It doesn't positively claim that there is no God, although individual atheists may take that position. Atheism itself is simply lacking this belief in God. In other words, it's a rejection of the God hypothesis. What this means is that, in and of itself, atheism bears no burden of proof in the discussion. There might be some positive claims made in the process that need to be proven, like when atheists claim there are contradictions in the Bible, but on the whole, since all atheism is a rejection of the God hypothesis, the burden of proof is on the theists. So when the theists come back with things like,
"Okay, silly, how did the universe begin without God?"
Sorry, but we don't owe you an answer on that. Of course, a lot of atheists, myself included, accept the Big Bang model as the one most supported by the evidence, but that's a separate issue. Someone can be an atheist and still reject the Big Bang. The atheist could just say, "I don't know," and it's a perfectly valid response. You don't get to win just because we can't come up with something on our own. The default position is "I don't know," and any hypothesis claiming to provide that knowledge has the burden of proof.
So how do you explain the complexity of the universe without a God?
Sorry, but we don't owe you an answer on that. Our rejection of your hypothesis does not require us to have a hypothesis of our own.
Oh, so you think you know everything, huh?
No, we don't. We just know that you haven't met your burden of proof, and we don't need positive knowledge of what's really going on to evaluate your claim and see that it fails miserably. Case in point, James McCormick sold a completely useless device called the ADE-651 to the militaries of 20 different countries, which he claimed detected bombs. The thing is, it doesn't work. At all. The ADE-651 is a rebranding of a novelty golf ball finder. It's basically a dowsing rod. One of the militaries that was using the device was the Iraqi military. They spent up to $60,000 each for the devices. They relied on them at their military checkpoints. On the 25th of October 2009, terrorists got 2 tons of explosives right past these bomb sniffers. And when they detonated their explosives, they killed 155 people. 2 months later, terrorists killed 127 people the same way. Now, here's the point. In order to tell you that this sham device doesn't work, I don't need to know anything about how to actually detect bombs. I don't need to be able to make my own bomb detector. I don't even need to have my own bomb detector. I don't need to tell you how bombs can really be detected. I don't owe you that explanation in order to tell you that the AD-651 is bogus. It is, and we all know it. And the sad thing is, the Iraqi military still uses this bogus device. Even though everyone knows by now it doesn't work, McCormick's company was shut down, and McCormick himself was convicted on 3 counts of fraud and sentenced to 10 years in prison in Great Britain. But when you've put a lot of money into something, or time, or emotional investment, it can be very difficult to admit when you're wrong. So we don't owe the theists any explanation for these things.
But where do you get your morality from?
Doesn't matter.
But wouldn't it be nice if there were a God?
Doesn't matter.
But religion has done a lot of good things.
Doesn't matter.
Stalin and Mao were atheists.
Read my lips. Doesn't matter. And then they go with stuff like,
well, you can't prove God doesn't exist.
So what? Don't have to. It's your claim. The burden of proof is on you. You can't prove that Bigfoot doesn't exist, or fairies, or leprechauns, or mermaids, and you don't have to. All you have to do is show that the people who believe in these things have not met their burden of proof. And that's all we have to do with you. Now, what does this have to do with libertarianism? Well, libertarianism is a negative philosophy as well. The basis of libertarianism is the non-aggression principle, also known as the non-initiation of force principle. Basically, libertarians reject the initiation of force as a means of achieving social or political goals. That's what libertarianism is. So right away, this demolishes pretty much all of the straw man arguments statists use against us.
You think the government is evil.
No, we just reject its claim that it needs to initiate force against peaceful people in order to manage society. Same with the word
Libertopia,
used to denigrate us by people who have no desire to even understand where we're coming from. No, we don't promise nirvana. As many libertarians have said, utopia is not an option. And of course, the concept of utopia comes from Thomas More's book Utopia, which is socialist in nature. More was far from libertarian. No, we don't promise utopia. We don't promise anything, in fact. We just reject your use of force against peaceful people to get what you want. We say your hypothesis that you need to do so is unproven. You have not met your burden of proof. Let's say we have 2 people, person A and person B. Person A wants to do something that requires no force. It involves no one but himself, or if it does involve others, they're voluntary participants. No costs are imposed on any third parties. But person B wants to do something involving force against someone else, either physical violence, or theft of property, or otherwise imposing costs on the third parties. Person A does not have to justify what he is doing to anybody, but person B does. If person B wants to use force to get what he wants, he absolutely needs to justify it if he wants to operate from a position of moral or intellectual validity. Libertarians don't say that person B is never justified. Maybe the thing person B wants to do is use force against someone who's raping a young woman, for example. Then his use of force is morally justified, but that burden of proof is on him. And yes, it even works this way in court. Even though our courts are based on the idea that the burden of proof is on the prosecution, when the defendant makes what's called a positive defense, the burden of proof shifts to him. He has the obligation to show the court that his use of force was reasonable to prevent a greater harm from occurring. Excessive force can be punished even if the force was used against an aggressor. Libertarians simply want this concept to apply to government as well. The burden of proof is not on those of us who insist on our right to speak, or to peaceably assemble, or to own a firearm, or whatever. The burden of proof is on those who want to take those rights away, and libertarians maintain that they have not met that burden of proof. All of the same responses to theist claims still apply.
How do you have a society without government?
I don't owe you that answer. You're shifting the burden of proof. You need to prove that your government is necessary for society.
Oh, so you know better how to run society, huh?
No, we don't claim to. We just don't think that you've proven that you know better, or more accurately, that your pet politicians know better. The article on Salon.com The question libertarians just can't answer has been answered over and over and over again by myself and by many other libertarians. But I do want to remark on one statement of theirs here. Quote, "If libertarians are correct in claiming they understand how best to organize a modern society, how is it that not a single country in the world in the early 21st century is organized along libertarian lines?" Actually, we don't claim we understand how to best organize a modern society. What we believe is that no government has met their burden of proof in demonstrating that they know how to best organize a modern society. So really, despite the fact that many libertarians have answered their question, the fact remains is we never owed them an answer to begin with. They're shifting the burden of proof.
But how would you feed the poor?
I don't know, but then again, I don't owe you that answer. And actually there are answers and lots of evidence that the poor would be much better off under libertarianism, but that's actually not the point. The question itself shifts the burden of proof.
But who would build the roads?
I don't know. I don't owe you that answer.
But how will you stop monopolies from forming?
As if government doesn't create monopolies all over the place. Sorry, but you don't get to demand that libertarians show that something wouldn't happen that happens all the time with your government.
But people need to be able to earn a living wage.
We've got all sorts of data showing that minimum wage hurts the poor. But for purposes of this discussion, we don't need it. It's the state that has the burden of proof to show that minimum wage helps. And they haven't met that burden. Here's something recent from the news.
What's the big deal with the NSA taking all this metadata? Can you prove the government's going to do something bad with it?
Even if I couldn't, it doesn't matter. The burden of proof is on the government to show that they need that data. That's why we have this thing called the Constitution, and why it says they have to get a warrant from the courts before they can do that.
But your right to private metadata isn't in the Constitution.
Doesn't matter. The burden of proof is on government to prove that they need it.
How do you organize society without government?
Doesn't matter.
But people would do drugs.
Doesn't matter.
But government has done a lot of good things.
Doesn't matter.
But Somalia!
Read my lips. Doesn't matter. And then they go with stuff like,
well, there's never been a libertarian society, so you can't prove libertarianism works.
So what? Don't have to. It's your claim that government is necessary. The burden of proof is on you. Just like with God and Bigfoot and fairies and leprechauns and mermaids. Again, all we have to do is show that statists have not met their burden of proof. And we have absolutely done so. In fact, this entire video series will stand as testament to that, as we examine the fallacies of statists that are incredibly similar and quite often identical to the fallacies used by theists. Stay tuned. A lot of you, especially a lot of atheists, have taken issues with the points I made in part 1 of this series, saying things like, it doesn't matter if I don't have the burden of proof, I still need to explain myself, or we have to prove this or that before we can allow people to act on their own, as they'd be able to do in a libertarian society. Well, I want to turn to some of the most prominent atheists for support, the hosts of the Atheist Experience, in their recent episode number 813, and I want to post 2 clips from this show, where they absolutely back up pretty much everything I said in part 1. First, I want to play what they said to a caller who said we need God to explain the universe.
You make the claim you don't know. I've heard you say that several times. You don't know how the universe
Sure.
is.
Before the Big Bang.
Okay, so why is it wrong for me to know?
Well, how do you know?
Well, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Yeah. How do you know that? How do you know?
How do you?
Two hosts here.
How do you know it's not true?
You're shifting the burden of proof. We don't have to
Doesn't
just prove
matter.
that.
Why does that matter?
Why does it matter?
Why
Okay.
don't you have to have the burden of proof?
Because we're not the ones that are claiming that we know. I'm sorry,
Well,
Corey.
exactly. So
Corey,
since you don't know,
Corey,
why can't I know?
Corey, knowledge is not something that you simply assert. Knowledge is demonstrated. And if you make a claim to knowledge, you need to demonstrate that it's true. Otherwise, there's no good. That's the way reason works.
Okay,
That's
hey, Corey,
the way.
Your reason.
Corey, are you infallible?
What do you mean by that?
Are you always right?
I think he means get a
Are
dictionary.
you?
Okay, I'm not playing this game. Goodbye.
See, I told you this was.
I'm not going to play the are you, were you? How do you know? Why? I'll tell you why. We establish a burden of proof because we understand that the application, by the way, you said, well, that's your reason. No, there's simply reasoning. There is the critical examination of evidence. Logic is not something where I've got my logic and you've got your logic. We know why, we know what logic works and why. There's a reason why I stick to propositional logic and constructed syllogisms, at least conversationally. And there's a reason why we establish the burden of proof. And that's because in your world, Corey, you get to claim that you know and you have no burden of proof, and so can 100 other people all know answers that don't agree with yours. And so now we're in a world where there's 101 different propositions out there that all claim that they know, and none of them agree with each other, and none of them want to take on the burden of proof. And what does the reasonable person do? Nah, screw all you guys. The first one of you that can actually demonstrate that your claim is true, that's where we're going to start saying, okay, let's investigate this further and find out if it is true. But all of you who are claiming that you shouldn't have any burden of proof, there's no reason any of us should care at all what you say. You might as well be saying that you know that M&Ms created the universe, because you have just as much evidence for that.
And here's what they said to a caller who was speaking against gay marriage.
I want to be a bit rushing without enough, basically.
No.
The studies have been done already. People have already been concerned, like you, that there's a problem with gay people raising children, and they did the studies and they found out there was not.
But none of that matters. This question, aren't we rushing? Aren't we rushing? First of all, no, we're not rushing. Second of all, you do not wait until you have an evidence that something is okay to do before you permit it. Instead, you permit things until you have good reason to think that you should not permit them.
Right, because
we have
all
been
other
wrongly,
things being equal.
hang on, we have been wrongly denying people equal rights based on naturalistic fallacies and all sorts of assumptions and fear that something may go wrong, and that is what is wrong. Not allowing people to have those rights is what is wrong. Instead, you allow people to have rights until you have good reason to take them away.
Realize that all I am doing here is taking these very same concepts and applying them to the rest of politics too. There is no difference. Welcome to the second video in our series on the common fallacies committed by both theists and statists. This video covers the concept of special pleading. This is a form of compartmentalization, where you posit some sort of universal rule, but then make an exception for whatever it is you're supporting. This is related to our first video on the burden of proof. Ordinarily, the positive claim has the burden of proof, but with Wu, it's quite often the case that they use special pleading to shield their claim from this burden. For example, homeopathy fails every double-blind test, but that's because
Homeopathy is special and just can't be tested that way.
religious people do this all the time. I've already covered one example in my video, Why Intelligent Design is Wrong. In it, I showed how intelligent design advocates say that no system can exist ad infinitum, cannot appear spontaneously, and cannot develop from less complex systems. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. Of course, they want that cause to be God, but that runs into a problem. If God cannot exist ad infinitum, could not have appeared spontaneously, and could not have developed from less complex systems, then that God needs a God to design him, and that God needs a God, and that God needs a God, and so on, in an infinite regress. The way they get out of it is to simply claim that one or more of these universal rules do not apply to God. God can exist ad infinitum when it's impossible for the universe to. But they don't realize that they've just shown that their universal rule isn't so universal. And as Carl Sagan pointed out, if you're going to say that the universe was created by a God who always existed, why not just save a step and say that the universe always existed? Another example happens when theists look to the universe for proof for their God. They may use such arguments as the argument from complexity, or fine-tuning, or many others, and express incredulity that this could happen absent a creator. But then when skeptics point to the evidence for an old universe, or the Big Bang, or any of the other findings that refute certain theists' claims about the universe, those are dismissed, because scientific observation all of a sudden just isn't reliable anymore. In particular, the nasty and often reprehensible behavior of the God of the Old Testament is often justified using special pleading.
There must have been some reason for these atrocities. It was a different time and place. God is all good and all-knowing, so if he does it, it must be moral. Who are you to criticize him? After all, he's God and you're not.
So when God says to kill adulterers and homosexuals, that's okay, despite the fact that thou shalt not kill is in his top 10 list. Actions performed or condoned by God are loving and wise, even though those very same actions committed by human beings on their own would be considered stupid, violent, evil, and even criminal. We lowly human beings use evil science to vaccinate our kids so they won't get certain diseases, but the God who caused and allowed those diseases to persist loves them more than we do. Fallible human beings create charities to feed starving people in the third world and give them clean water, but the God that made those conditions in the first place is all-loving and all-powerful. Of course there's the flip side. In many religions, if you don't fall to your knees and bow and scrape to whichever God in particular they believe in, then you'll receive punishment in the form of eternal torture, forever and ever and ever, no matter how good a person you were otherwise. But if a parent demanded this of a child, if any human being demanded this of any other human being, it'd be way beyond criminal. It would be considered psychopathic, and the person would likely be locked away for a very long time. So why is it any different with God? Oh, right.
Because he's God!
What's interesting is the different factions of theism engage in special pleading when dealing with each other. When Christians debate Muslims, for example, they each demand evidence from the other that they're not able to provide themselves. And even different denominations of Christianity claim that the Bible supports their own particular beliefs. Even the same passages of the Bible are interpreted in different ways to support the varying beliefs of these sects. So how do statists engage in special pleading? Let me count the ways. Like God, actions committed by the state are considered justified when those very same actions committed by private individuals would be punished as criminal. If you think someone is threatening you and you go and kill them, then as long as they weren't acting on that threat, you can be charged with murder. Unless, of course, you're the president and you use a drone to take him out in a foreign country. He even gets to take out American citizens without even so much as setting foot into a courtroom, and several bystanders as well. Imagine if someone comes into your home and you think they may be armed, and you forcibly search them. This could easily be considered battery in a court of law, and if you search them on their genitals, you could even be convicted of sexual assault. But if you're at an airport and your uniform has the letters TSA on it, all of a sudden it's acceptable, and what are you complaining about? Do you want the terrorists to win?
Why do you hate America?
Another example is the misanthropy that permeates many forms of statism. The idea that humans are fundamentally evil, or irrational, or greedy, or selfish, or whatever. And therefore we can't just leave them to their own devices. We need a government to keep these people in line. But who is going to comprise this government? Government is just a group of people, nothing more. So if people are fundamentally greedy and selfish, then it stands to reason that government will be greedy and selfish as well. Unless you somehow think those in government are cut from a different cloth? As Milton Friedman repeatedly asked, where are these saints and angels that you're going to have to find to run the country? And even beyond that, statists assert all the time that we need a government to do X, Y, or Z because no private entity could.
We need government to feed the poor. We need government to manage our retirement. We need government to fund science. We need government to create jobs. We need government to fix the economy.
On and on and on. But what is so special about the group of people in government that gives them abilities that other people in the private sector don't have? If you say that a certain group of people can do something that no other group of people can do, you're ascribing to them supernatural abilities. And politicians become priests and saints and demigods. This is what libertarians mean by the phrase, the cult of the omnipotent state. The assertion that only government has the skills and knowledge to perform these tasks. Personally, I have to give the edge to the theists here. At least they acknowledge they're positing the supernatural. Statists try to hide it. Want proof? Just check in the comments of this very video. I'm certain you'll see statists denying it here. And like religion, statism even engages in special pleading among its own factions. When George W. Bush started lying to get us into wars with Iraq and Afghanistan, the Democrats were outraged and even called for his impeachment. But when Obama took office and started telling us the same lies to get us into war with Libya and Syria and Iran, liberals, for the most part, were silent. Up until the 2008 election, anti-war rallies attracted hundreds of people, most of whom were waving Obama signs. After Obama took office, most anti-war rallies consisted of about a dozen libertarians and a tumbleweed. Even many liberal commentators have bemoaned the fact that the anti-war protests have slackened immensely under Obama. Another example is the NSA wiretapping scandal. During the Bush administration, this was a terrible thing, but under Obama, what's the big deal? And yes, it goes the other way too, before you Democrats engage in your favorite activity of playing the martyr. The IRS scandal where they arbitrarily punished Tea Party groups has outraged Republicans, even though the practice dates back at least to Richard Nixon. Where was the outrage when their guy was doing it? And oddly enough, statists even engage in special pleading when trying to attack libertarianism. A conservative attacking libertarians might say,
I like your ideas on the economy, but you're just out to lunch when it comes to gay marriage and the war on drugs. Don't you know that marriage is between one man and one woman? Do you want our kids to be able to buy heroin from vending machines in their school?
We get the same response from liberals.
I like your stance on gay marriage, but ending the minimum wage? Why do you hate the poor?
No matter how many studies we show them demonstrating that the minimum wage itself hurts the poor.
You want to get rid of regulations, so you want the big corporations to take over?
No matter how much we show them that regulations are why big corporations are taking over, since they can absorb the costs of compliance better than small businesses that compete with them. Get it? The parts of libertarianism that I agree with are good. It's those parts that disagree with my pet government projects that become insane and stupid. For whatever reason, they're just completely unable to apply the criticisms of the policies they hate to the policies they like, even though for the most part, they're pretty much the same criticisms. Especially when it comes to things like,
alcohol prohibition was stupid and didn't work, but we need the war on drugs.
For another example, Mitt Romney campaigned against Obamacare, even though it's pretty much the same legislation he passed as governor of Massachusetts.
But that's totally different. It's fine when the states do it, but it's not good when the federal government does it.
More examples.
Ron Paul's not gonna win any caucuses. Just you wait and see. What? Ron Paul won a caucus? Well, caucuses don't count. It's great the government passed all this stimulus spending to fix the economy. What? The economy's not any better? That's because we didn't spend enough.
Get the idea? There's always an explanation, except one where the statist is wrong. Just like with God, no matter what criticism you come up with, it's just different somehow. That's really what this series is about. Many statists commit the same fallacies as theists, but then deny it because it's just different somehow. And as we'll see throughout this series, they employ this tactic judiciously to avoid the problems with all of the other fallacious reasoning they employ. Stay tuned. Welcome to the third video in our series on the common fallacies that both atheists and libertarians run into while debating their opponents. This week, it's a pretty insidious and persistent concept known as Pascal's wager. This was first posited by philosopher and mathematician Blaise Pascal, and comes from his book, The Ponzi. Here's the gist of it. Either God exists or he doesn't. That is a true dichotomy. According to Pascal, there's no way to intellectually defend either proposition, but you must wager on one or the other. So he says to wager that God exists because, quote, there is an infinity of an infinitely happy life to gain, a chance of gain against a finite number of chances of loss. And what you stake is finite. There is no time to hesitate. You must give all. And thus, when one is forced to play, he must renounce reason to preserve his life, rather than risk it for infinite gain, as likely to happen as the loss of nothingness. So if God doesn't exist, there's nothing to gain or lose either way. But if God does exist, and you don't believe in him, you give up an eternity in heaven, and possibly even gain an eternity in hell. So let's go over it point by point.
Either God exists or he doesn't. You have to choose one or the other.
There's all sorts of problems with this, starting with an excluded middle. While the choice between God or no God is a true dichotomy, he's actually implying a very different dichotomy. Either no God exists, or the God that does exist values belief over reason. But what about the possibility of a God that values reason over belief? That God would reward you for sincere intellectual reflection, even if you don't end up convinced that he exists, and might actually not like you believing in something, even him, when there just isn't any evidence to do so. Let's say that such a God is equally likely. Then, believing in God over reason is just as likely to win as it is to lose, and the benefit of the wager goes away. Plus, one might think that the God of reason is actually more likely, since he did apparently give us brains capable of reasoning. And what about the possibility of a God that demands true belief, not just belief because you're playing the odds? He might get mad that you're just pretending so you can get a reward later on. If we put this third possible God into our mix, then believing simply because of this wager becomes more likely a losing prospect than a winning one. There's also the big problem of, which God do you believe in? Yahweh might get mad if you choose Allah and send you to hell, but Allah might get just as mad if you choose Yahweh. And choosing either might earn the scorn of Quetzalcoatl if it turns out he's the real God after all.
If you gain all. If you lose nothing.
It's just not true that the cost of betting on God and losing is zero. What would you have done as a result of this false belief? How much time do you spend in church, and how much money do you give them? Also, what happens to your desire for intellectual fulfillment when you can just answer every question with, God did it? And how does it affect your relationship with other people who aren't the same religion as you? Do you trust them less, even though you have no reason to? Do you lobby your politicians to ban gay marriage or working on Sunday or whatever, even though those actions don't have any effect on your life in any way? What about enjoying your life to the fullest? If you really like pork, but the religion you choose says not to eat pork, you're going to miss out on something you enjoy. And if your religion says not to get blood transfusions or even seek any medical care when you're sick, you might be in for a really bad time and a much shorter life. Of course, the biggest problem with Pascal's wager is that it's nothing more than fear-mongering disguised as intellectual exercise. Because you see, people know this intuitively. They know they give up stuff by adhering to a religion. So to get people to do it, you have to scare them with either giving up eternal life, or even worse, being subjected to eternal torture after you die. They're actually preying on the economic concept of delayed gratification, where you invest by giving up money or something else you've earned in exchange for a greater rate of return down the line. When you think about it like that, it actually sounds pretty sad that they have to promise an infinite return on the investment to get you to believe. But a bank can get some of your hard-earned money for a whole year by offering you a CD with less than a 2% return. If I remember correctly, infinity is larger than 2. So how does this fallacy relate to politics? We actually see the same failed logic over and over again from statists. One prominent example has to do with global warming. No one of any rationality denies that the planet is warming or that humans are contributing to the effect. But that doesn't mean we get to skip over the entire risk-benefit analysis like many environmentalists want to do.
But we just can't wait any longer. We have to act to stop climate change now, or we're all doomed.
They've been saying that for over 20 years now. And what action do they want us to take? Of course, it's the same environmental agenda they've been pushing on us the whole time. We have to cut emissions. We have to make people use biofuels. And why? In his Nobel Prize-winning PowerPoint presentation, Al Gore showed what would happen if global warming caused the sea level to rise 20 feet. The problem is, no scientist is actually predicting anything like that to happen in the next 1,000 years. The IPCC's worst-case scenario for the next century is 55 centimeters. In the 20th century, it rose 19 centimeters. Was it a problem? Sure, for certain places who were able to mitigate the damages on their own. Most of the damage from global warming can be taken care of in this way, and much more efficiently.
That doesn't matter. We can't afford to wait or we'll destroy the planet.
They said this back in 1997, when the US failed to sign on to the Kyoto Protocol, even though the best estimates showed it would make very little difference to CO2 levels over the next century. Now they're saying this about measures such as cap and trade, which, oddly enough, BP is lobbying in favor of. Exxon is lobbying in favor of biofuels. Could it be that the oil companies are turning over a new leaf and protecting the environment? Or are they just seeing an opportunity for cronyism, allowing them to profit more than they ever have before? Of course, the big problem is when you have government try something that doesn't work, or even makes the problem worse, it's really difficult to overturn it. Environmentalist groups went gaga over corn ethanol, and of course, so did the corn growers. And they passed laws for government to subsidize the production of ethanol and require a certain portion of it to be in gasoline sold to consumers. All to stop global warming, of course, but the fact is, once you account for factors of production, corn ethanol actually produces more CO2 for the energy you get from it than gasoline. So in the past few years, most environmentalist groups have turned against corn ethanol, but all of those legal requirements are still in place, mostly because the corn growers still love it. And boy, do they have lobbyists. It's even worse than Pascal's wager, where the cost of betting wrongly is zero. Here, if we bet wrongly, we may be stuck with an eternity of government programs that don't work and even make the problem worse. Of course, there's nothing at all wrong with doing a proper cost-benefit analysis and seeing what the best course of action is to take. And there's other advantages to things like alternative fuels to be considered. That's exactly what Bjorn Lomborg has been advocating for years. Of course, the response of the environmentalists is to call him a climate change denier, even though he doesn't deny anthropomorphic global warming. He just doesn't buy into their so-called solutions. We see Pascal's wager in our foreign policy too.
We just can't wait. We have to overthrow our dictator of the week. You don't want those people to suffer, do you?
So if we act now and overthrow the dictator, the people will be happy. If we wait, the people will be miserable that much longer. The problem is, very rarely does it seem to work out that way. Iraqis aren't much better off now than they were under Saddam, and terrorist groups were able to gain a toehold there where they weren't under Hussein's regime. Afghanistanis keep suffering horrible oppression long after the US overthrew the Taliban. And as we just saw, many Egyptians had enough of their country being run by the extremist group Muslim Brotherhood, which Obama had been supporting and giving aid to. Even more moderate responses don't seem to achieve results. The sanctions against Iraq under Bill Clinton resulted in an estimated 500,000 children dying. When then Ambassador Madeleine Albright was asked about this on 60 Minutes, she replied, quote, "We think the price is worth it." But nothing much happened to Hussein or anyone in his regime. So just like religion, the costs of taking this action to get these future gains are not zero. And there's just not much evidence that those future gains will come. There are lots of other examples where statists do this too, from the war on drugs to the minimum wage to lots of bogus scares like the Ford Pinto. But really, although we could spend all day relating Pascal's wager to the fear-mongering the government proponents love to engage in, there's a bigger issue. Statism itself is one big Pascal's wager.
Let's weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that we need government to solve our problems. Let us estimate these two chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then, without hesitation, the government is good. Pretty
much every single problem with Pascal's wager as it applies to God applies here. First of all, which government? Socialist? Communist? Democratic? Republic? Fiefdom? We seem to be constantly inundated with one controversy or another over how the state should rule our lives, as both parties try and implement their agenda and vie for our votes. As we've seen, the cost of betting on government solutions and losing is not zero, and again, it's just fear-mongering disguised as intellectual discourse.
But who will build the roads?
There was actually a political cartoon going around a while back with a factory and the owner outside of it chagrined because the stateless society he was in didn't build a road for him. It would have been an excellent parody of the statist position if the cartoonist hadn't been serious. Do people actually think we'd have no roads without government? Bet on government and you'll get roads. Bet against government and everyone will be standing on their front porch scratching their heads wondering how they're going to get anywhere. Yeah, right. If that's not Pascal's wager, it's certainly close enough. The main thing about Pascal's wager is this. You're given a false choice. Eternal life or no eternal life. Roads or no roads. A safe environment or the destruction of the world. Wars, marijuana, healthcare, minimum wage, on and on and on and on and on. Pascal's wager, or something similar, is used to defend all of these. Which is not to say that there are no good arguments for any of them, but Pascal's wager certainly isn't one of them. And as we'll see in part 4, it's the case that a lot of statists just can't wrap their heads around society functioning any other way. Stay tuned. Welcome to part 4 of our series on the common fallacies of theism and statism. And this week, we look at a curious mentality that they both possess. The inability to conceive of a system of bottom-up spontaneous order and thinking that all forms of organization must be managed from the top down. It's easy to see this happening with theism, especially creationism. How many times have you heard this?
When was the last time an explosion resulted in a fully assembled 747?
So the idea is that even if you had all the parts of an airplane, just tossing in a stick of dynamite and expecting them to spontaneously assemble is ridiculous. And it is. But then they use this to try and say that evolution just can't happen.
Evolution just can't happen.
See? But there are problems here. Jets are not alive. Jets do not reproduce. Jets do not mutate. And the parts of jets don't have affinities for one another the way natural biological components do. Years back, Charles Kopek posted a brilliant video to YouTube where he examined a similar analogy from creationists. Take apart a clock, put the parts in a box, shake it up, and you don't get an assembled clock. But Kopek showed, using genetic algorithms, that if you use the evolutionary process, a bottom-up system of spontaneous order, you can get really accurate 2, 3, and even 4-handed clocks without anyone having to design a thing. But why take Kopek's word for it? You can check it out for yourself. Just go to boxcar2d.com and see evolution in action for yourself. It starts off with random cars that don't do much other than fall apart. But just by chance, some of them work kinda sorta okay, going forward a little bit. The ones that work better breed the next generation, with random mutations, and some of those work a little better still. Before too long, you can get some pretty clever cars that perform amazingly without any human input at all. Or take a look at the creations from Lee Graham's algorithm. This end-over-end worm evolved from creatures that didn't function nearly as well. In fact, the first generation, randomly generated, could do little more than fall over and maybe wiggle. This is the result of generations of evolution, again with no human input at all.
Okay, but that's just playing around on a computer. I bet it doesn't have practical uses.
You lose that bet. Check this out. This antenna was evolved, not designed, by NASA for its ST-5 spacecraft. Starting with random bent pieces of metal, the ones that worked better as antennae were used to breed the next generation, which mutated. After several generations, they came up with an antenna that was far superior to the helix design humans had come up with before, all without any human influence whatsoever on the design. The problem is, when human beings see systems acting in a certain way, we tend to attribute agency to them. When we see a system that appears organized, it's tough for us to believe that it's happening spontaneously. We think there must be a single mind somewhere directing it. But science has shown that it ain't necessarily so, and an excellent example of this is a flock of starlings. Starlings move around in a most unusual fashion. Unlike some other migratory birds, there's no leader. No one starling is showing the others where to go. Further, there's no hierarchy of leaders and followers. Each starling is a peer in this system. Here's how it works. Each starling moves in the same direction as the others. Each starling tries to stay close, but not too close, to its neighbors. And starlings also avoid collisions. These three simple rules are all that's needed to reproduce this amazing flight pattern in computer simulations. Of course, there's some other stuff going on. As migratory birds, starlings are influenced by magnetic lines. There are rules for when they land to rest and take off again, that sort of thing. But the thing about it that's a bit hard to believe but is absolutely true is that, even in flocks of hundreds of thousands of starlings, no starling needs to know about any more than its 7 nearest neighbors. That's it. This is spontaneous bottom-up organization of the kind that tends to flummox both theists and statists alike. So how do statists fall into this trap? It's because they have the same incredulity about society doing things without government, particularly in regards to the economy and the market. Hear it from Chris Clark of Free Thought Blogs. Libertarians postulate that unfettering everyone's most self-serving economic motives is the best way to create a vibrant, egalitarian economy, just as unfettering a giant, unstable slope of rocks on a steep hillside is the best way to create a stone cathedral at the base of the hill. Sound familiar? Yep, it's just the old 747 argument all over again. By not understanding that the market is fundamentally a bottom-up system of self-organization, they fall into precisely the same trap as the creationists who insist that there must be a God because life couldn't form any other way.
But wait a minute, you guys have the invisible hand. That's the same thing, isn't it?
Actually, no, it isn't. The invisible hand is a metaphor, first described by economist Adam Smith. In The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he wrote, "The rich only select from the heap what is most precious and agreeable, though they mean only their own conveniency, though the sole end which they propose from the labors of all the thousands whom they employ be the gratification of their own vain and insatiable desires, they divide with the poor the produce of all their improvements. They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessities of life of which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among its inhabitants, and thus without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interests of the society, and afford means to the multiplication of the species." He expanded on this idea in The Wealth of Nations. "Every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. He generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own security, and by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it." So the point of the invisible hand is not that there's some mysterious top-down force directing the market. The point is, there's not one. This is a metaphor. It only appears as though there's an invisible hand. And so when we look at it, we tend to associate it with an agency. It really does seem like statist atheists gave up on the notion of God as a top-down designer, but just couldn't get their brains to think bottom-up, so they had to come up with a replacement. And there was the state, all ready to claim credit. Well, if that's the case, I have an object right here in my hand that will make you quake in your boots. The object of your pain that takes your precious status delusion and stomps on it, tears it to shreds, and flushes down the toilet. It's right here. Get ready to quake. It's a pencil! But you're not quaking. Why are you not quaking? You're supposed to be quaking, but I'm sensing a distinct lack of quakage. Oh, I know. You're not quaking because there's a fact about this pencil that you don't know. That if you did, would cause all of these status claims to fall apart. And that fact is this. No one in the world knows how to make a pencil.
Oh, come on. Someone knew how to make a pencil. Otherwise, how did it get made?
Well, how do you think it got made?
Well, someone took some graphite, put it in between a couple of pieces of wood, and clamped a piece of rubber onto it with a bit of metal.
Okay, what kind of wood? I'll tell you then. It's called incense cedar, and it grows in the northwestern U.S. So do you know how the cedar is cut, shaped, pressure treated? And incense cedar is white. It's colored for pencils because people like the looks of it. Do you know how? And using what kind of pigment? And you mentioned the graphite. Well, graphite's a powder. So how do you get it into this solid form so you can make marks on paper with it? You have to mix it with clay and burn it in a kiln. Do you know how hot? And for how long? What kind of clay? And what proportions? And you mentioned rubber for the eraser, but the rubber doesn't really erase marks. It's just there to hold it together. Do you know what erasers are really made of? Well, it's usually some kind of gum made from soy. Do you know how to grow and harvest soy? And it's usually solidified with something like sulfur chloride. Do you know how to get sulfur chloride? How to handle it safely? And how to mix it with the soy and the rubber to get the eraser? Actually, the rubber they use nowadays is synthetic. How is that made? And from what? And that bit of metal, what kind of metal is it? Where do you mine it? How do you refine it? Hey, it has to be painted too. What kind of pigment is used? What kind of oils? How are they extracted from nature and mixed together? And how do you make all of the tools, saws, digging equipment, kilns, and everything else that's used to get all these materials extracted, shaped, and delivered? Oh yes, they have to be delivered from all over the world. The components have to be shipped in boats or on planes and trucks. And so we have all of the people who drive these vehicles and who manage them and plot out the routes. And at the factory where they're assembled, well, how do you build the factory? Pour the concrete. Mix the concrete. Where do the materials to make concrete even come from? And the steel and the plastic and everything else that goes into it. The fuels to run it or generating the electricity. And then there's the workers. They all need to eat that hamburger they have for lunch. People need to grow the cattle and slaughter them and prepare them. Lots of things that lots of people do before it even gets to the restaurant that fries it. And of course, the hamburger needs to be fried on grills made from metal and Teflon. Do you know how Teflon is made? And then there's the oil it's fried in, raising the vegetables for that, and the wheat and everything else that goes into the bun. Milling the flour, on and on and on. The coffee they drink on their breaks with beans from South America, and the soda they have with lunch. Do you know how to carbonate water? Do you know how phosphoric acid is made? What about the sweetener, growing and refining cane sugar or corn syrup, or an artificial sweetener such as aspartame? What about the kind of paper it's wrapped in? What about...
Oh, now wait a minute. You're talking about what they eat, not what they make pencils with.
So what? They still have to eat, don't they? And I'm not even scratching the surface here. They have to go to work in cars or buses or ride bicycles. So we have all of the things that go into manufacturing internal combustion engines and tires and steering wheels and seats and...
Okay, I get the idea.
Do you? You also need to realize that a lot of people whose time, labor, and ingenuity went into all of the things that go into making a pencil are long dead. The people who invented the technology, developed the processes, today's engineers and designers are just standing on their shoulders.
Okay, yeah,
But nothing! You've also got the developments that people made, not just independently of making pencils, like making trucks and things like that, but things that happened because pencils were being made. Pencils used to be made out of eastern red cedar. Who was it that figured out incense cedar was better? And how? For that matter, the lead in the pencil is called that because it used to be made of lead. Who figured out that graphite was better? And how? We may not know any of that, but we do know the why. Because people want pencils, and finding a better wood to make them out of, or a better material used to make the lead, or the eraser, or whatever, is a great way to make a profit.
well, yeah, they did it to make a profit, not to help people.
But that's exactly the point. Most of the people whose time and labor and ingenuity go into making a pencil don't even realize that their product will be used that way. And the ones who do are not doing it because they want you to have a pencil. They most likely don't even know you or will ever meet you. Millions of people play a role in making a pencil. And like the starlings, they don't need to know about any more than a handful of the others. There is not one single person, not even the designers at the pencil companies, not even the CEOs, who know all the steps that go into making a pencil. And even if you took everyone in the pencil company and put them in a place with only natural resources and none of the other things I mentioned in ready-made form for them to use, they wouldn't even know where to begin to get the things they need to make pencils. This all happens with no mastermind, no intelligent designer at the top directing all of this. And this is just a pencil. Can you imagine how much more complex this phenomenon is with something like, say, a smartphone?
But don't we need government to do all that?
How? How is government going to get all the information they need to make a pencil? We've pretty thoroughly established that no one person or even one cohesive group of people could possibly know all the steps for making a pencil. And government is just a group of people. They have no way of gaining this knowledge, no way of directing the steps, and trying to butt in to manipulate even one part of this process is inefficient at best and at worst harmful to real people, to even their very health and livelihood.
But that's social Darwinism.
Is it? Let's compare this with evolution then, since you insist. Evolution is a natural bottom-up process. Try and control or direct that process from the top down, and you get eugenics. And we saw how well that worked out. So if anything, it's government regulation and manipulation that's the social Darwinism here.
But we need government to protect jobs.
Protect them from whom? When cars came out, people stopped buying buggy whips. Do you know what happened to the people who made buggy whips?
They starved?
No! They went on to do other things. Maybe instead of making buggy whips, they made fan belts or something. Saying that these people would starve if they went out of business is exactly as ridiculous as saying that all of the people who sell iPhones wouldn't have a job if it weren't for iPhones. They'd just be selling something else, or have a career doing something different, as long as government isn't monkeying around with the economy and creating unemployment, that is. So the next time you feel incredulous about such and such happening without government, the next time you feel like asking, who will build the roads? The next time you feel like agreeing with the president who says, you didn't build that, remember the pencil, and the buggy whip, and the creative forces of the market that stem from no central authority, but from the individual autonomous actions of profit-seeking individuals. And understand that every single thing you have, no matter how much government may want to claim credit for it, is the result of millions of people working together peacefully and voluntarily to make it happen, even if they don't even realize that's what they're doing. And above all, understand that whether you're talking about God or government, your incredulity, your feeling that certain things just aren't possible without either of those, means nothing. But that's the subject of part 5. Stay tuned. Welcome to part 5 of our series on the common fallacies committed by both the religious and the pro-government. This week, we look at the argument from incredulity, also known as the argument from ignorance. This is where someone asserts his claim has been proven because there is no evidence to the contrary. Here are some common examples.
I saw something in the sky and I don't know what it was, so it must have been an alien spaceship. My cancer went away and my doctors don't know how. It must have been because I prayed. You can't prove that vaccines don't cause autism, so until we know, we need to be on the safe side and not vaccinate.
Here's an example from a rather shameful period in American history.
You must be a communist because you can't prove that you're not.
If this sounds like a shifting burden fallacy, like what we talked about back in part 1, well, you're right. But there's another element of it too, and that's been summed up by the common phrase given by many a woo.
Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Well, it certainly isn't evidence for your claim. At best, it means we should withhold judgment. But not only that, sometimes absence of evidence is evidence of absence if we look where the evidence should be and it isn't there. It also tries to avoid the unlikelihood of their premise, or at least the superior likelihood of alternatives. Let's say it's 1947 and you're in the town of Roswell, New Mexico. You see something fall from the sky. You run to check it out, but before you get there, lots of military guys pull up in jeeps and grab you and take you away somewhere. So now you're at the table with the light over it, and they're asking you questions about what you saw and how much you know. Once they're satisfied you've told them everything, they let you go, but warn you that if you talk to anyone about it, you'll be arrested or even killed. That night on the news, you see a story saying that what fell from the sky was a weather balloon. But you think, why would the military be that concerned about a weather balloon? So when someone suggests it was really an alien spaceship and the military was covering up, do you believe them?
Well, yeah. Why else would the military have reacted that way?
Well, if it were an alien spaceship, yes, you'd expect the military to react that way. But is that the only reason? What you need to think of is the likelihood of an alien visitation absent your experience. This is called prior probability. And if the prior probability is low, you need a lot of evidence to overcome it. Or, as Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
But you don't know what it was.
So what? That doesn't mean your set of evidence is enough to overcome prior probability. And how do you feel after Congress passes the Freedom of Information Act and we find out it was a spy balloon trying to see if the Russians were doing high-altitude tests of nuclear weapons?
Sounds like another cover story to me.
Ah, but how did you know the weather balloon story was a cover? Because the evidence didn't fit it. But if it were a spy balloon, what would you expect? You'd expect the military to question you to find out what you knew, and release you after threatening you if you talked. Exactly the same evidence that led you to conclude it was aliens. But the spy balloon hypothesis has a much higher likelihood than aliens, especially for 1947. And think about this. Before, when that explanation wasn't available to you, you thought aliens because you couldn't think of anything else it could be. But now, looking back, you can see that you should have considered one other alternative, that you didn't have enough information to get the real answer. Anytime you're faced with something like this, where you can't think of an alternative, remember that. It just might be that if you were in possession of all the facts, an alternative hypothesis would be obvious. Probably the biggest example in religion is known as the God of the Gaps argument. Remember this guy?
Tide goes in, tide goes out. You can't explain it.
Yes, I can. Tides are caused by the moon's gravity.
Okay, but how did the moon get there? Pinhead?
See, you fill one gap, they just jump to the next. And it doesn't even matter that we've got a pretty solid model explaining how the moon formed. They can just jump to something else. Any hole in our knowledge would do. Creationists do this all the time.
You don't have a missing link between apes and humans.
Well, humans are apes, So I'll interpret this to mean between humans and our last common ancestor with chimpanzees, Sahelanthropus. And we do. There's Australopithecus africanus.
Well, now you have two gaps. One between Sahelanthropus and Australopithecus africanus, and one between Australopithecus africanus and Homo sapiens. You now have two missing links.
No, they've been filled. In fact, between Sahelanthropus and H. sapiens, we have Ardipithecus, Australopithecus afarensis, A. afarensis, A. africanus, Homo habilis, H. erectus, H. heidelbergensis, and H. rhodesiensis.
But that's 8 missing links you have to fill.
See how it works? Each gap you fill in just creates 2 more. This happens all the time with origins.
You don't know how life started, so it must have been done by God.
Remember what we said earlier? What's the alternative you should always consider?
I don't have enough information to get the real answer?
See, you're learning. Lots of scientists have theories of abiogenesis that are being tested and refined. Any one of these has a greater prior probability than God, and even before we had any idea about any other possibility, there's still the possibility that no one has the information to get the right answer. Yet. Just like with the Roswell aliens. Maybe God did it, or maybe you just don't have enough information to reach the right conclusion. I think we both know which one has the higher prior probability. So how do statists engage in the argument from incredulity? Do I have to do it again?
But who will build the roads?
As we've discussed previously, the fact that you can think of who will build the roads does not mean they won't be built, and it certainly doesn't mean the government will build them better. And this is far from the only question.
Who will feed the poor? Who will put out fires? How will you stop crime? What will stop people from dumping toxic waste into our rivers?
And just like with atheists, it's, you can't explain it. Even if I can't, so what? That doesn't mean you win by default. As discussed in part 1, that does not absolve you of your burden of proof. All it does is speak to your lack of imagination. It's government of the gaps. In fact, it's hard to think of any statist arguments that don't comprise an argument from incredulity in some way. They really can't imagine how this can be achieved through peaceful, voluntary cooperation. But this itself raises an important question. Do you really trust someone who knows so little about a subject to control it through the use of force? Not only that, it shows a complete inability to think about things in any way other than imposing one solution on others. They're essentially asking,
so what one solution will you force on others?
As pointed out in part 4, we don't have our own way that we want to impose on others. We don't have direct answers for these questions, not because we can't think of any answers, but we can think of lots of possible answers, and we want people to have the freedom to explore which solution works for them. Maybe some private roads will be toll roads. Maybe some residential roads will be built by a homeowners association, as many are today, in fact. Maybe roads in a business park will be paid for by the businesses who want customers to have easy access to their stores. Sit and brainstorm. I'll bet you can think of a dozen different possibilities. Which way is best? The libertarian doesn't claim to know. We just aren't that arrogant. And that's really what this fallacy is all about. Arrogance. Whether you're talking about God or government, the essence of the argument from incredulity is this.
If I can't think of an alternative, there must not be one.
But whether you're a statist or a theist, you have to stop and think that maybe you're just not clever enough, or don't have the right experience, or don't have as much information as you need to see alternative solutions. And once you learn to have the humility to see that this option just might have a higher prior probability than the statist solution you're advocating, you put yourself in a much better position to discuss libertarian and market-based approaches to all of these problems. Stay tuned. Welcome to part 6 in our series comparing the experiences between atheists and libertarians as they each debate their opposition. This part is all about exclusivity. Both atheists and libertarians have to deal with people who want to exclude them from society, or at least inhibit their own personal activities that don't affect anyone else. Religion has a shameful past of being oppressive whenever it's gained any degree of power. Just think of the Crusades and the Inquisition. Even today, religiously dominated governments in the Middle East and elsewhere are creating a lot of trouble for the rest of us. Even here in the First World, we're having problems. In places such as Denmark, you can't even draw a picture of Muhammad because
you might offend a Muslim.
In the UK, even though they've technically gotten rid of the blasphemy laws just 2 years ago, you can still be arrested because
that speech is offensive to some people.
And if a religious person is offended by your blasphemous speech and it gets called hate speech, well, that law really wasn't repealed now, was it? Even here in the US, the country where freedom of religion is guaranteed by the Constitution, and yes, that includes freedom from religion, at least freedom from being forced to adhere to Bronze Age mythology in some way.
We need creationism taught in schools. Teach the controversy. We need to stop contraceptives. Ban pornography. We need abstinence-only sex education policies.
They even have sneaky ways of slipping in abortion restrictions. It's true that not all religious people want to force these views on others, but a lot of them do, and they can be a potent force in society. So how do you allow for diverse ideologies in a system that's dominated by religion? The answer is, you can't. Like the big Indians and the little Indians of Gulliver's Travels, you have to eat your eggs the way they say to. And if you want to eat your egg from the other end, well, prepare to be ostracized or even punished. A secular system, on the other hand, would let people eat their eggs however they want. And this was the absurdity of the Lilliputians, that this possibility just never occurred to them. Jonathan Swift wrote that part of the novel based on the conflict between the Catholic Church and the Church of England that was going on at the time. If the C of E was in power, you weren't allowed to be Catholic, and vice versa. Guy Fawkes wasn't trying to blow up the Houses of Parliament to overthrow a tyrannical government so that we could have freedom. He was trying to overthrow a tyrannical Anglican government to establish a tyrannical Catholic government, and neither one could allow for the existence of the other. And the religious right in this country doesn't want to allow for things like contraception and pornography. There really is no difference in that regard. But, since atheism is a negative philosophy, what it would impose is a secular system where people can believe what they want. And before you bring Stalin and Mao into the conversation, understand that, although they were atheists, the problems with their system was not the negative philosophy of atheism, it was the positive philosophy of communism that drove them to do what they did. Just as you can be whatever religion you want in a secular system, but you can't be an atheist in a theocracy, you can practice whatever political philosophy you wish in a libertarian system, but you can't practice libertarianism in a statist system. If you're in a libertarian system, and you're a Marxist who thinks the workers should own the means of production, then you can set up your factory the way you want, and give each of your workers a share of the company. No one will force you to run your business any differently. But what happens in your system when I open my factory and I'm not doing that?
Hey, you're exploiting those workers.
Really? I don't think I am. But either way, what are you going to do about it? That's the key. If your solution is,
I'll show you. See how much better my system does. Listen to my arguments and let me convince you.
Then that's fine. And maybe you will convince me. But you'll have done it without force. And guess what? If that's what you think should happen, you're a libertarian. More than that, you're a capitalist, because you think that capital should be privately owned and managed. But if your solution is,
I'll send men with guns to close down your factory if you don't comply,
then you want a Marxist system imposed on others by force. The libertarian system let you set up your Marxist factory, but the Marxist system doesn't let the libertarian set up his factory in any way that the Marxists disagree with. Let's go all out. What if you're a pure communist? Then you and your communist friends buy up a bunch of land and set up your commune. But what about the rest of us, who are owning private property and making voluntary exchanges with money? Well, it's the same thing, isn't it? You're either going to use force to stop us, or you're not.
Yes, we're gonna make you conform to communism.
Then your communist system will not allow for libertarianism the way libertarianism allowed for communism. Or,
No, I'm not gonna use force. Screw you guys. We'll be over here doing our own thing.
then congratulations, you're a libertarian. We libertarians may laugh at those Venus Project nutbars as being economically ignorant, but in a libertarian society, we wouldn't lift a finger to stop them from making the attempt. The fact that we don't think it's going to work is irrelevant to our policy that allows you to live your life in whatever way makes sense to you. But a lot of them say that the Venus Project won't work unless everyone participates, and then we have the problem. Because that means that while a libertarian society will allow for the Venus Project to operate inside it, the Venus Project will not allow any libertarian operations. This goes back to the arrogance we talked about in Part 5. All forms of statism are some form of the following.
I'm gonna force you to live your life a certain way because I know what's best.
Or at least the high priests in government know best. Again, libertarianism doesn't do that, because libertarians don't claim to know how you should live your life, or run your business, or interact with others. As long as you do it without the use of force, you're free to try your own thing, take whatever risks you feel are worth the rewards, and decide whom you're going to interact with and how. And if there is this group that comes around calling themselves government and says that if you'll just pay them 20% of your income, then you can vote for them and listen to their wisdom and do what they say because they know best, and you believe them, no libertarian will stop you giving your money to them. We only complain when those services are forced on others or when others are forced to pay for them. This is a pretty good general rule for finding out what system or philosophies or whatever are worthwhile. Can they stand on their own in the marketplace of ideas, or do they need to use force or the threat of force to get their way? If they need to use force, then why should we assume that they have anything worthwhile to offer anyone else? A sure way to tell an idea is worthless is when the person says,
It's my way or the highway.
if you're not confident your way is best, then you shouldn't force your way on others. If you are confident your way is best, then you shouldn't need to force your way on others. It's as true in government as it is in religion. And it's especially true when it's a minority of people trying to force themselves on the majority. But that ends up being surprisingly effective because of a phenomenon we'll discuss in Part 7. Stay tuned. Welcome to Part 7 of our series on the common tactics and effects of both the religious and the statist. Before we continue, I want to clear up some confusion about the word statist that's been going on in the comments. For the purposes of this video series, I'm basically using the word statist to cover anyone who isn't a libertarian. So a statist is someone who does believe that it's justified to initiate force against others in order to implement some public policy or another. Now, while this makes libertarianism and statism a true dichotomy, it should be pointed out that very few statists agree that this should be universally applied to every issue. But even if you agree with libertarians on everything else, if there's just one policy that you feel government should initiate force to implement, then at least in the context of that one policy, you're a statist and the complaints here apply to you. For example, the burden of proof is on you to defend your use of force to implement that particular policy, as stated in Part 1. So now that that's clear, let's move on to a very interesting phenomenon I like to call the paradox of interests. Here's the idea. There's something that benefits a few people that imposes costs on a much greater population. Let's say the ratio is 1 in 1,000. The interest group represents 0.1% of the population. And so we can use numbers for the purpose of illustration. Let's make it monetary. The 0.1% is doing something that takes money from the rest. Since the money given to each member of the interest group is taken from 1,000 others, then for every $10,000 one member gets, other people only pay $10 apiece. Now here's the important part. How much incentive do each of those members have to act to gain $10,000?
Yeah, I'm I'm gonna do a lot. It's 10 grand.
And everyone else?
Why bother? It's only $10.
You can see how one-sided this is. No matter how much someone might be chagrined at losing $10, it just isn't worth the effort to try to stop it. Certainly not the same amount of effort one is willing to go to gain $10,000. There's actually a common scam based on this idea. A con artist makes up a whole bunch of fake invoices for $5 and sends them to 1,000 different companies. Since it generally isn't worth going through the whole accounts payable system to verify the invoice, a lot of them just pay it and move on. Let's say half of them do. 500 companies send him $5, and now he has $2,500, which he had to do very little to earn. The benefits are concentrated, but the costs are dispersed. So now you might begin to understand why there are so many lavish churches and parsonages, despite the fact that many church members donate to the church because of the good that it can do for others. Think of the extravagance of televangelists, or the Vatican. Just put a few dollars in the collection plate and multiply it by thousands of church members, or even millions of followers worldwide, all for a business that doesn't really have any sort of tangible product to offer. That tithe may just be 10% of your income, but the churches end up raking it in. It's not just about money, though. More insidiously, it's about power. No matter how many parishioners may feel it's their church, it's really just a few people making the rules, and rules that only slightly inconvenience individual church members can mean a lot of power for those in charge. Taken to extremes, this means that pedophile priests can abuse children for centuries, systematically supported by the Catholic Church itself, and even when people finally get around to raising a stink about it, neatly avoid prosecution. This is the paradox of interests. Priests and church leaders have a far greater incentive to keep the status quo as it is, or change it for their own personal benefit, rather than the rank-and-file members do to improve the church for their own benefit. The reason why is that the costs of these benefits the priests enjoy are spread out over a greater number of church members. So if they want to install gold-plated toilets, they have more of an incentive to work in favor of that than the church members do to oppose it. In the world of public policy, this is known as the political interest paradox, although as we've seen, it's hardly limited to politics. But we see it everywhere in our political system.
The problem with politics is all of those corporate lobbyists.
Okay, that's a problem, but when was the last time you went to Washington to try to stop it? This is the political interest paradox. Since benefits are concentrated, but costs are dispersed, these corporations actually have a much bigger incentive to lobby politicians than ordinary people like you and me. The financial crisis is a perfect example of this, with things like the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, and Fannie and Freddie ready to step in and cover banks that made bad decisions that came back to bite them. And Congress certainly didn't help with bailouts and so-called stimulus money. You have a situation where profits are privatized, but losses are socialized. The risk to the profits the banks made resulted in costs that were spread out among a much greater population. Libertarians have their own saying for this expression: Tea Party syndrome. The Tea Party was initially formed as a libertarian movement to convince Congress to cut spending and put the budget on a better long-term sustainable footing. But as more and more powerful people got involved, and especially after the Republican infiltration, it became a living example of the paradox in action. They all want to cut spending, but not for their programs.
Let's cut funding to Planned Parenthood, but we shouldn't cut the military.
Over on the left, a lot of liberals countered,
No, we need to fund Planned Parenthood. It's the military we should cut.
because of the paradox, the result will be to keep both Planned Parenthood funding and the big military, because both sides have a greater incentive to keep programs that they like than they do to cut the budget in general. We see this all the time among public polls, too. Many of them have found that, while a majority of Americans support cutting total spending, a majority oppose cutting funds for specific programs. Now, it's a different majority each time, and they're divided among whether spending should stay the same or increase, but you see the problem. Everyone agrees we should cut spending, but when it comes time to make specific proposals, you will always have those opposing the cuts, and they have far greater incentive to oppose cutting the funds than the rest of us do to support it. What this means is that the paradox of interests results in a status quo that everyone agrees is inefficient, but no one is willing or able to change.
Okay, so how would your free market be better?
In the free market, nothing is beyond reproach in this way, and what works today may not work tomorrow. If you have a business and you're doing something incorrect or inefficient or obsolete or in some way less than the best you could possibly do, then the incentive is there to change and improve your business. And if you don't or can't, you face the possibility of a competitor coming along and taking your clientele. If you can't do as good a job, there's a real chance you might even go out of business as people flock to your competitors.
And then people lose their jobs.
Well, short term, yeah, but this does not put people in impoverished situations, cast out and useless to society. It just means they go and do something else. Your workers will find work elsewhere, and you can create another business and hopefully apply what you've learned. But maybe not. Maybe you just don't have what it takes to be an entrepreneur. There's nothing shameful in that, any more than there is in not having what it takes to be a brain surgeon or a concert pianist. This is why we have workers. That isn't wage slavery or anything else like that. It's people utilizing the skills they have without having to take on the burdens of running a business when they have no talent as a businessman or no desire to do so. You see, different people are different. They have different preferences, goals, outlooks, and priorities. The paradox of interests turns them into a greedy mob, but the market works quite differently. Instead of trying to fit everyone into the same mold, the market recognizes and even encourages these differences and allows them to work together. Here's an illustration based on economist David Ricardo's work. Let's say you have the first two human beings in the world. Solely to upset the creationists, I'm going to call them Adam and Steve. Adam and Steve need lots of things to help them survive, but I'm going to focus on two tools they need: axes to chop trees and shape wood, and spears for hunting and fishing. Adam isn't too bad at either of these. He can make an axe in 3 hours and a spear in 4. But Steve is much better. He can make an axe in 2 hours and a spear in just 1. So he can make both of these in the time it takes Adam to make just an axe. This may sound to those of a Marxist bent as if Steve doesn't need Adam. He'll go on making his spears and axes, and poor Adam is left to suffer. But that's complete economic ignorance. Notice that Adam is better at making axes than spears, and Steve is better at making spears than axes. It actually doesn't matter that Steve is better at making axes than Adam is. This diversity leads to an economic exchange that makes both their lives better. Think about it. If there's no exchange, then Adam takes 7 hours making an axe and a spear, and Steve does it in just 3. But if Adam makes 2 axes and Steve makes 2 spears, then Adam is only working 6 hours and Steve just 2. They then trade an axe for a spear. They've each saved themselves an hour of labor, an hour that can be spent hunting or fishing, or making a shelter, or even just resting after a hard day. Multiply this by all of the different products and services in the economy and all of the people in the world, and you can imagine the wealth that comes to people as a result of the free market. In fact, you don't have to imagine it. Just look around. Even the poorest person in America is better off than Adam or Steve, or even better off than the richest person in 1800. But the paradox of interests means that, in a situation run by government, these incentives are perverse. Since Steve only has to lose 3 hours making an axe and a spear, while Adam loses 7, then Adam has a much stronger incentive to lobby the government to take axes and spears from Steve than Steve does to lobby against it, because Adam gains 7 hours by doing so, but Steve only loses 3. Now multiply that economy-wide. The middle class, created by the free market, has been seeing fewer and fewer gains as government gets bigger, due to the paradox of interests. But in the free market, it's not a paradox. It's a recipe for making everyone, not just a few special interests, wealthier. There just isn't any way around this intellectually. So once again, the statists resort to the same tactics as the religious. Things like accusing their opposition's philosophy of being immoral. But that's part 8. Stay tuned. Welcome to part 8 of this series as we continue to see the similarities and the fallacies that both theists and statists often resort when attempting to refute their opposition. This time, it's about how they both often resort to the argument from morality. In other words, trying to claim that their position is morally or ethically superior or impugning the morality of their opposition's viewpoint. At an extreme, the person may claim that his belief provides a source of objective morality that is unimpeachable. This sets up an interesting situation where anything that source does automatically becomes moral. In religion, the argument goes something like this.
No one can be moral without God. Morality exists, therefore God exists.
And of course, what would happen if God didn't exist?
Well, then we'd just be animals.
And even more extreme,
what would stop us from running around and raping and killing everybody?
Of course, there are lots of problems with this. For one thing, there are many different gods written about in various religions, all of whom have a different moral code. But even if we just confine ourselves to Christianity, we find a lot of things that we consider to be immoral, and rightly so. For example, keeping slaves, or stoning adulterers and people who work on Sunday.
Death to the gays!
But more than that, it's pretty dehumanizing. It means that people would only perform moral acts for selfish reasons, to avoid being punished.
Be good, or you'll go to hell.
They also use morality to attack their opponents. For example, creationists keep making the claim that evolution is immoral, but evolution is descriptive, not prescriptive, and as such, it cannot be moral or immoral.
If children are taught they're animals, then they'll behave like animals.
Or even,
evolution is about survival of the fittest. They're saying we should kill our weakest members.
Of course, evolution doesn't say that at all, but that hardly stops them. Funny thing is, when you look at it, their moral code isn't very consistent. There are many passages in the Bible where it's perfectly okay to burn villages and kill innocent children and even babies if God says it's okay. It's amazing how the moral code can change whenever a devoted follower says God wants it to. This brings in an important concept, Euthyphro's dilemma. This is a Platonic dialogue between Socrates and Euthyphro discussing the issue of morality. The basic question is an act moral or immoral because God says it is, or is God merely passing on to us what is moral and immoral all by themselves?
It's moral because God says so.
Then if God tells you to murder children, that must be good.
But no, God's just telling us what's objectively moral.
Then we don't need God, and we can determine this objective morality on our own. Cut out the middleman.
But no, it's moral because God says so.
And the argument inevitably goes around in a circle. Of course, there are completely secular moral creeds out there, and that would seem to negate the entire argument. Statists also employ the argument for morality all the time.
Without government, what would stop us from running around killing and raping everybody?
Sound familiar? It's the exact same argument. Just replace God with government. People are inherently evil and need a threat of punishment to keep them on the right track. There's no difference. Well, except for the fact that we have no proof that hell actually exists. Prisons certainly do, but there's no indication that we'd all turn into mass-murdering rapists without it. Of course, we find all sorts of different moral codes in governments. We have the extremes like Nazi Germany, where the good thing to do is kill all the Jews. Of course, our government is too enlightened for that. But it does throw people in jail for having a few ounces of a plant in their pockets.
But drugs are bad!
But what happens when government does bad things to fight drugs, like raid the wrong house and kill the family dog, or take people's property without so much as charging them with a crime? How often do any of them get punished? Now think about this. You're living in a dictatorship. Your dictator makes it nigh impossible for citizens to band together to broadcast their criticisms of him. He goes after websites that post leaked documents revealing his corruption. He assassinates his own citizens and invades other countries that pose no threat. He monitors everyone's communications without a warrant, makes you show your papers to travel around the country, takes people's possessions without even so much as charging them with a crime, makes it hard for people to create businesses that compete with his wealthy friends, and kicks people out of their homes to give that property to those same wealthy friends. Now, what do you think about that guy?
Well, he's a tyrant. The people need to overthrow him.
Well, okay, but the U.S. does all of these things. Does that mean we need to overthrow our government?
Well, of course not. We're a democracy.
And so, a democratic government becomes their god, no matter what they do. Again, morality should be applied consistently. If it's wrong for a dictator to do something, if it's wrong for you and me to do something, then it's wrong for a government, even a democracy or a republic, to do it as well. And yet, the statists use the very same special pleading to let their own state out of its moral limitations.
But people voted for them.
Oh, so since a majority of people said they wanted this, it's immoral not to go along with it? So then, what about elected officials who go against their party leaders? Are they being immoral now? And would it be right for those party leaders to force them to vote their way? There's no difference. And what about outside of government? If Christians outnumber atheists, does that mean that Christians get to call themselves lawmakers and pass laws restricting what atheists can do? Hey, you know what else the majority of those involved agree on? A gang rape. See the problem? Morality must be consistently applied. If majority rule is good for one group, it must be good for all groups. And clearly, it isn't. They even attack the science that goes against their God, only instead of evolution, they go against economics. For example, when the economic consensus says that the minimum wage causes unemployment for the very people it's supposed to help, they scream,
Why do you hate the poor?
But they're not saying the poor don't deserve better pay, they're saying it doesn't work to force it. Again, it's descriptive, not prescriptive. Consider this comment from Itchyback on part 1 of this series. Ethics with your philosophy is the most dubious one. There is none, and you fail. And the funny, sad thing is I can see you, Shane, playing around ethics which have no objectivity, and you pigeonhole all that think ethically otherwise as statists. There is no good, at least objectively, nor bad if the cat is black or brown. Nor is there morality of any kind good or bad in free market. But when you draw in ethics, or was it me, there is no free market. Just subjective statements, libertarian and statist. Again, no difference at all from the theist argument. And yes, it's just as dehumanizing.
Be good or you'll go to jail.
Jail or hell, it's pretty much the same idea. Okay, so jail actually exists and hell doesn't, but that's irrelevant to the point. The idea is that people aren't going to behave unless they have selfish reasons for doing so, to avoid punishment. See how similar it is? We even have an analog to Euthyphro's dilemma. Lots of statists say things like,
You need to follow the law because that's the moral thing to do.
But there was a time and a place where turning Jews in to be executed was the law. Was that the right thing to do? In this country, there was a time when turning in fugitive slaves and those who helped them was the law. Was that the right thing to do?
Well, that's just different.
Really? Just like it's different when God told people to kill children? Let's face it, there is no difference, morally or logically speaking, between those kinds of laws and the laws that say we should go after people who smoke pot, or drink big gulps, or who pay their employees less than we think they should. And both parties do it. Republicans want to enforce morality in the bedroom, and Democrats want to enforce morality in the wallet. And both make exceptions when it's their people in power doing it. The fact of the matter is, just that there is no God, but people who wrote the Bible, and people who act as the priests and others condescending to tell us what God really says, there also is no government. There is no separate entity you can point to and say this is government that gives it any special dispensation from any of the logical problems we've discussed in this series. No, government is nothing more than people. It's people who make the laws, people who enforce them, people who are selective about enforcing them, people who interpret them, and on and on and on. And those people have no special claim to be above the morality they would impose on the rest of us. How dare they, statists and theists alike, repeatedly advocate immoral acts when committed by their God or government, and then turn around and say that it's our philosophy that's immoral? Stay tuned. Welcome to part 9 of our series, where we look at the important similarities between the arguments against atheism and the arguments against libertarianism. And one such argument is to claim that this country or other was atheist or libertarian, and look how horrible it turned out. And of course, there's the one they always turn to first.
Hitler was an atheist.
Actually, there really is no evidence of this. All of Hitler's proclamations on the subject were very religious in nature, including these from Mein Kampf. Hence, today I believe that I am acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator. By defending myself against the Jew, I am fighting for the work of the Lord. The folkish-minded man in particular has the sacred duty, each in his own denomination, of making people stop just talking superficially of God's will and actually fulfill God's will and not let God's word be desecrated. Almighty God, bless our arms when the time comes. Be just as thou hast always been. Judge now whether we be deserving of freedom. Lord, bless our battle. And many of his speeches. My feelings as a Christian points me to my Lord and Savior as a fighter. In boundless love as a Christian and as a man, I read through the passage which tells us how the Lord at last rose in his might and seized the scourge to drive out of the temple the brood of vipers and adders. How terrific was his fight for the world against the Jewish poison. Lord God, let us never hesitate or play the coward. Let us never forget the duty which we have taken upon us. God the Almighty has made our nation. By defending its existence, we are defending his work. All of the available information shows that Hitler was a very strong Bible-believing Catholic.
Well, of course that's what he said in public, but it could have all been for show.
Okay, maybe, but he also practiced Catholicism in private as well. For example, his marriage to Eva Braun was a proper Catholic ceremony, at his insistence, even though there were only 5 people in the room at the time and they were planning on committing suicide a day later.
But you don't know. He could have really been an atheist and not told anybody.
Again, maybe, but all you've done is admitted that you have no evidence for him being an atheist to begin with, let alone blaming atheism for Nazism. And in fact, the Nazis placed on their list of banned books, quote, all writings that ridicule, belittle, or besmirch the Christian religion and its institution, faith in God, or other things that are holy to the healthy sentiments of the Volk. How many atheists would have done that?
Well, okay, but they were at least Darwinist.
No, because they also banned, quote, writings of a philosophical and social nature whose content deals with the false scientific enlightenment of primitive Darwinism and monism, Haeckel. Not only were the Nazis not atheists or Darwinists, they actively opposed those ideas.
All right, fine. Hitler was a Christian. But that doesn't mean that Christianity is to blame for Nazi ideas.
Of course not. But it means that atheism isn't to blame either, and that was your original claim.
Okay, fine. You win with Hitler, but we've still got Stalin and Mao.
Okay, you're right. Stalin and Mao were atheists. They didn't believe in God. But does that mean that their atheism is to blame for what they did?
Well, of course.
Even though you just admitted that Hitler being Catholic doesn't mean that Christianity is to blame for the Third Reich? Aha! Got you thinking there. The key question is, Did Hitler or Stalin or Mao operate by the principles of rational atheism, which rejects dogma and encourages rational inquiry based on unrestrained scientific and sociological inquiry? And the answer is, clearly, they did not. In fact, if you look at it, all they did was substitute another form of dogma. Hitler and the Nazis revered National Socialism precisely as though it were a religion, and Stalin and Mao did the same with communism. They did believe in a sort of God of nature, but the people were prohibited from worshiping God because it got in the way of worshiping the state, and their people did by and large come to view them as gods on earth.
Yeah, it really was a cult.
Right, it was. But a cult is not atheism. There's also some cherry picking going on here. Why didn't you look at predominantly atheist countries like Norway or Iceland? Maybe because it wouldn't make your point? There's also the niggling little fact that, as a percentage of the population, atheists are way underrepresented in prisons, while Christians are represented proportionally. They're also less likely to have abortions or unwanted pregnancies, and many other statistics also seem to favor atheists. Now, none of this is to say that atheism is per se better, but it does counter the claim that atheism turns people into unfeeling killers who run oppressive and genocidal governments. So this whole idea of trying to point to an atheist country and blaming atheism for the atrocities committed there just doesn't work. So what does this have to do with libertarianism? Well, how many times have we seen this? A libertarian thoroughly trounces a statist's arguments only to have them come back with,
But Somalia!
as if the mere mention of Somalia as a country somehow invalidates all of the reasoning and the facts. But why would that be?
Because Somalia is libertarian.
Is it? How?
Because it doesn't have a government.
Well, actually, it does now, but for purposes of this discussion, we'll refer to Somalia's stateless period between the fall of the Barre regime in 1991 and the UN forming the provisional government in 2004. So, how does Somalia being stateless make it libertarian?
Because libertarians are against the state.
Well, no, not really. Remember part 1? What libertarians are against is the initiation of force. So do the people of Somalia abide by the non-aggression principle? Yeah, that's what I thought. Simply getting rid of the government does not make a country libertarian any more than burning down all the churches will turn people into atheists. In fact, most Somalis are Muslims who believe in Sharia law. So, like with Stalin and Mao and the rest, the key question is, was there ever a point where any significant number of Somalis embraced the non-initiation of force principle? And the answer is, clearly, they did not.
Okay, but shouldn't they at least have been better off without a government?
Of course they should. And they were. In Peter Leeson's paper, Better Off Stateless, Somalia Before and After Government Collapse, published in the Journal of Comparative Economics, the benefits of statelessness to Somalia's citizens far outweighs the negative impacts. In fact, out of 18 key development indicators, 14 improved under statelessness, while only 2 worsened: adult literacy and school enrollment. And they worsened because the UN pulled the aid that was almost the sole source of educational funding under Barre. Access to potable water stayed the same, and the remaining one, per capita GDP, is too difficult to calculate accurately.
Well, why don't you move there then? I'll tell you why. Because you're better off in America.
Well, yeah, because America's a developed country that hasn't recently been under the heavy militaristic oppression of a socialist dictator. But is it really reasonable to expect a country to undo decades of statist destruction and go from being one of the least developed states to a fully developed westernized society in just 13 years? For that matter, is it valid making a comparison at all with a completely different country and culture on the other side of the world? If any cross-country comparisons are valid, it's between Somalia and its 3 nearest neighbors, Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya, and to see how each country progressed in these indicators over time. And again, we see Somalia coming out ahead. While again, per capita GDP is difficult to calculate, Somalia improved in life expectancy, infant mortality, sanitation, and telephone main lines over at least 2, if not all 3 of its neighbors. Access to improved water pretty much held its own, and adult literacy was the only one where it did worse. And that might be because figures aren't even available for Djibouti and Ethiopia. Also, without a government to manage it, the Somali shilling, which experienced hyperinflation under Barre, was much more stable under statelessness. Overall, Somalia went from a condition of starvation and malnutrition to one where food, quality drinking water, and other necessities were plentiful. They went from a warfare state to a society where conflicts were isolated and sporadic. Healthcare improved greatly, including immunizations and life expectancy, as well as the number of physicians per capita. Both infant and maternal mortality dropped, and the percentage of low-weight infants plummeted. The poverty rate dropped like a stone, and the number of people with access to radios, TVs, and telephones rose dramatically. Leeson concluded, quote, Somalia remains a country with severe problems, but it appears to have fared better under recent statelessness than it did under government. A comprehensive view of the data that allow pre- and post-anarchy welfare comparisons suggests that anarchy has improved Somali development in important ways. Contrary to our typical intuition, in Somalia it seems that social welfare has improved because of, rather than despite, the absence of a central state. The emergence of anarchy in 1991 opened up opportunities for advancement not possible before government's collapse. In particular, economic progress and improved public goods provision in critical areas flourished in the absence of a monopolistic and corrupt state.
Well, okay, but all that really shows is that anarchy is better than a bad government, not a good government.
Fine, but it still means you have no basis for your claim that Somalia is either libertarian or worse off without a government. And besides, when we look at countries ranked on their level of economic freedom, it's the ones at the top of the list, such as Hong Kong, New Zealand, Australia, and Switzerland, that do well, while the ones at the bottom of the list, like Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe, languish in poverty. And it's a pretty smooth grade from top to bottom. All of the evidence shows that the more libertarian a country is, the better off its people are. Just like with Hitler, just like with Stalin, just like with Mao, there is no validity whatsoever in using this shortcut around the serious problems of the claims that you make. They do not stand up to scrutiny, they aren't even valid examples of what you're talking about, and it ignores other more valid examples. Whether you're a theist who mentions Nazi Germany but not Norway, or a statist who mentions Somalia but not Hong Kong, all you're really doing is proving that you either lack basic research skills or you're so afraid of the opposition's ideas that you have to lie to oppose them. And that's not good for anyone. Stay tuned. Welcome to part 10 of our series on the oddly common ways that the thinking of theists and statists goes wrong. And here's one very weird way, how they can dismiss, in advance, the results of experiments that haven't yet been done. For example, some homeopaths say,
You can't test homeopathy with double-blind placebo-controlled studies. It just doesn't work that way.
It isn't just the special pleading like we talked about in part 2. It's the fact that they know what the result of these studies will be even before they're done. They know in advance that these studies will end up with a negative result and that they'll have to explain away that result. This goes to something Daniel Dennett calls belief in belief. This is where you claim you believe something without actually believing it. And the weird thing is, you might even believe that you believe it, without actually believing it. I know that sounds weird, but let me explain. Carl Sagan once recounted a hypothetical conversation.
I have a dragon in my garage.
Okay, show it to me.
Well, it's invisible.
Then I'll put flour on the floor and observe its footprints.
That won't work. The dragon constantly hovers.
So I'll detect the heat from the fire.
Sorry, but it only breathes invisible cold fire.
Alright, I'll spray paint the dragon.
That won't work either. It's incorporeal and the paint won't stick.
And so on. Now, Sagan's point was that this is an untestable, unfalsifiable hypothesis, and there's no way to distinguish between a garage that contains this dragon and an empty garage. But let's combine this with Dennett's insight. Suppose instead the person said,
"Hey, that spray paint thing's a good idea. Let's try it."
And only when it failed, he said,
"Oh well, I guess the dragon's incorporeal."
Then the person would still be deluded, holding to an unfalsifiable claim, but his belief would be genuine. It's coming out directly before any such test has ever been done and saying,
"That won't work. It's incorporeal and the paint won't stick."
That lets you know that this is belief in belief. It's because he knows ahead of time what the result of the experiment will be and how he'll have to explain it away. He may honestly believe that he believes a dragon is in his garage, but his expectations will always be the same results that would occur with no dragon at all. His mental model of the universe works precisely as it would if there were no dragon. He might honestly believe that he believes that the dragon is there, but he doesn't actually believe it. Now, do I really need to tell you how this applies to religion?
God exists. I know because the Bible says so.
Okay, well, I've come up with a scientific test that'll determine whether or not he's there. What do you say we do it?
Oh no, the Bible says you shall not put the Lord your God to the test.
Oh, really?
Yes, and Jesus said it again to the devil when the devil tried to get him to do such a test.
Well, that's convenient, isn't it?
Because faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen.
So you're saying you should refuse all tests about God?
Yep, just like Ahaz did to Isaiah.
So throughout the book, Christians are actively discouraged from doing actual tests to see whether or not God is real. And why might that be, Could it be that the biblical authors knew ahead of time that these tests would fail and that the universe would behave exactly as if there were no God? And how many Christians today say the same thing?
God can't be proven scientifically. You just have to have faith.
They may believe that they believe that, but if they really believed in God, then they shouldn't hesitate to do any of these tests. I believe in gravity, and I'll do any test based on the current scientific gravitational model anytime you say. But what happens when, for example, a long-term study of intercessory prayer shows no benefit from praying over those who are sick? What's the Christian reaction? Christianity Today concluded, "Our prayers are nothing at all like magical incantations. Our God bears no resemblance to a vending machine. God seems to have granted favor without regard to either the quantity or even the quality of the prayers. True to his character, God appears inclined to heal and bless as many as possible. It is as if he can barely restrain himself, though he often does, from supernaturally intervening and disrupting the nature of the universe to care for those he loves, whether they acknowledge it or not." Did God answer the prayers of the study's official prayer teams? Yes. But more than that, he answered the prayers of the patients, of their friends and relatives, and perhaps even of those who may not have known they were praying. Okay, so we have the usual after-the-fact wrangling, but the funny thing is, as that very same article pointed out, they didn't need to actually wait for the results of the study to know what they would be. Here's what C.S. Lewis wrote in The Efficacy of Prayer. "I have seen it suggested that a team of people, the more the better, should agree to pray as hard as they knew how over a period of 6 weeks for all the patients in Hospital A and none of those in Hospital B. Then you would total up the results and see if A had more cures and fewer deaths. And I suppose you would repeat the experiment at various times and places so as to eliminate the influence of irrelevant factors. The trouble is that I do not see how any real prayer could go on under such conditions. Words without thoughts never to heaven go, says the king in Hamlet. Simply to say prayers is not to pray. Otherwise, a team of properly trained parrots would serve as well as men for our experiment. You cannot pray for the recovery of the sick unless the end you have in view is their recovery. But you can have no motive for desiring the recovery of all the patients in one hospital and none of those in another. You are not doing it in order that suffering should be relieved. You are doing it to find out what happens. The real purpose and the nominal purpose of your prayers are at variance. In other words, whatever your tongue and teeth and knees may do, you are not praying. The experiment demands an impossibility. See, Lewis knew ahead of time what the results of any such study would be and how he'd have to explain it away. He may have honestly thought he believed that the prayer in such a study wouldn't be real prayer, but the fact is, his mental model of the universe behaves exactly like a universe where prayers are not answered at all. And guess what? Once again, libertarians have experienced exactly this phenomenon when dealing with statists. How many times have we heard this?
There's never been a libertarian society in all of history.
So then what? That means we shouldn't try it? In the 16th century, someone might just as easily have said,
There's never been a country that banned slavery in all of history.
Right. There never had been. Until there was. Would you have told the Wright brothers that they might as well give up since there'd never been a successful heavier-than-air aircraft before then? What would happen to human progress if people took this attitude about everything? Ironic that many who posed this question called themselves progressives. But here's the real point. It sets up an obvious trap. We can't ever try a libertarian society until there's actually been a libertarian society and we can see how well it works. But then, how do you ever get that first libertarian society? There's no logical way to do it. So why do they set this trap? Could it be that they know in advance what the results will be and that it won't go the way they want? At the very least, they must consider it likely enough to be afraid of the results. Their actual beliefs, their mental model of how the universe works, doesn't conform to what they claim to believe, what they may actually think they believe themselves. Here's another one we get all the time.
Libertarianism is just like communism. It works on paper, but no way it can work in reality.
First of all, let's forgive the fact that communism doesn't work on paper. Let's ignore the fact that it's mathematically unsustainable and economically non-viable. Also, let's ignore the implication that simply looking good on paper is good enough to disprove it. If it doesn't even look good on paper, if the mathematics and the economics don't work on paper, what reason do we have to think it'll work in the real world? No, let's forgive all of that for now. This is just another example of belief in belief. By their own admission, there's never been a libertarian society. So this knowledge that it doesn't work any better than communism, by their own admission, isn't based on empirical data. Again, it's the fact that they know ahead of time what will happen and what they'll have to respond to that clearly indicates that, no matter how sincere they're being, what they think they believe doesn't match their actual expectations of how reality will behave. So just like with the dragon, they need to do whatever they can ahead of time to cut off any tests at the pass. It happens in the details too. In an earlier video on this channel, I was talking about the data showing the harm caused by minimum wage. A user named Waddy Mutters said to me,
Okay, provide the studies, and I'll show you how to read them correctly and show you where you were deluded.
Now understand, he did not look at me citing a study, look it over, and determine that I was reading it incorrectly. He hadn't looked at any studies at that point. If you assert you know the answer before it begin, it doesn't matter how many studies you find to support it. You were right or wrong the moment you made the statement, and nothing in the universe can change that. But there's more. It's not just that he presupposes the conclusion. It isn't just his smug, arrogant assumption of superior knowledge. It's that he already knows what the studies will say and that they have to be read correctly to get the right answer. It's belief in belief. In his mind, he expects any test to come out the way it would if the minimum wage caused harm, and he needs to prepare for that eventuality. The study has to be read correctly, just like the Bible has to be read correctly when it says the earth is flat. This is where cognitive dissonance comes in. This is the stress you get from holding contradictory beliefs. In this case, it's where their stated political position is at odds with their internal mental model of how the universe behaves. In fact, minimum wage is a perfect example of this.
We need a living wage! Raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour!
What, do you hate the poor or something? Why not make it $50 an hour or $100? Hey, why don't we make it $1 million an hour and we can all afford private jets?
Well, now you're just being silly.
Why?
Because it won't work to raise it that much. It'll be destructive to the economy.
But if increasing the minimum wage is destructive, then why do you want to increase it by a smaller amount? So they know that if they do a big minimum wage increase, that it'll cost jobs and raise prices. In their mental model of the universe, that's what happens. And then they'll be embarrassed because the destruction caused by their policy will be obvious. But if you only bump it up a little bit, you only do a tiny amount of damage and it gets lost in the noise. All of the other factors that make unemployment go up and down end up overpowering it. But that doesn't mean that the damage isn't there. It just means that it's small enough that they don't have to face the negative consequences. So watch out for that. There are a lot of studies they like to trot out showing that a small minimum wage increase has no measurable effect on unemployment. Because the increase is so small, the effect gets lost in the noise. When someone presents such a study to you, ask yourself why they restricted themselves to only looking at small increases in the first place. That is why it's belief in belief. They may honestly believe that they believe the minimum wage is beneficial, but in their mental model of the universe, it isn't. And so they'll only advocate minimum wage increases that are so small that they can blame the resulting unemployment on other factors.
It's those greedy corporations again.
Inflation is another example. Governments love inflating the currency, and what's the reason they give?
Inflation means the economy is growing.
But isn't it funny that whenever they actually examine growth in the economy, all of the figures are adjusted for inflation? Why would that be? If inflation is an indication of a growing economy, shouldn't you include it in your growth figures? Controlling for inflation means that they don't actually believe there's any link between inflation and economic growth. They may profess that belief for political reasons. They may have even convinced themselves that they believe it. But again, their actions show that they don't actually consider inflation to be a measurement or cause of economic growth at all. Belief in belief happens when the consequences of not believing are too much to bear. Maybe someone has a lot emotionally or financially invested in the outcome. Maybe it's a long-held belief. Maybe it's a situation where it would be embarrassing to admit they got it wrong. Maybe they genuinely fear that society would be damaged if that belief were destroyed. Whatever the reason, they have already, in a real sense, been convinced that they are wrong, since they expect the universe to behave that way. Even if they still consciously believe it, that belief doesn't match their expectations. That's belief in belief. This is what you see whenever someone comes up with an excuse not to do a particular test, or some way of explaining away the results of a test he hasn't yet seen.
Oh, God healed the control group too.
Which is, in itself, a tacit admission that intercessory prayer makes no difference in outcomes.
That unemployment must have been caused by something other than minimum wage.
Which, if nothing else, acknowledges that the unemployment did in fact occur. And the fact that they know this will happen ahead of time means that they already believe that intercessory prayer doesn't work, or minimum wage causes unemployment, or whatever else it might be that runs contrary to what they profess to believe in. They know, deep down, that there's no dragon in their garage, and whatever experimental test is done will turn out exactly as it would if the garage is empty. And so the test needs to be intercepted, or avoided, or explained away. Really, how is
You shall not put the Lord your God to the test
any different from
There's never been a libertarian society in all of history?
The answer is, it isn't. And everyone who makes those arguments knows it, even if they believe that they believe otherwise. Stay tuned. As the sides of their respective arguments making the negative claim, both atheists and libertarians are inundated with religious people and statists barking on about how they're wrong. Of course, we find these statements unconvincing. Our standard of evidence is actually reasonable, and therefore the claims of statists and the religious don't meet it. But as a result of that, we get these same statists and theists saying that we're just so stubbornly incapable of admitting that we're wrong. Of course, if that were the case, very few of us will be atheists or libertarians to begin with. Growing up in a society where we're inundated with religion and statism, that's pretty much the default. And most people who become atheists or libertarians are the ones who break from that. It's far more likely that an atheist grew up a Christian and a libertarian grew up a statist on the right or the left. Still, the question of what if we're wrong is a perfectly valid question, and it's time we answered it.
What if you're wrong about God?
First of all, there would need to be convincing evidence for the existence of God. So let's say that there were. What would that mean?
That would mean the Bible is true.
Really? Why the Bible and not the Quran, the Book of Mormon, the Bhagavad Gita, the Kojiki, the Egyptian Book of the Dead? You see, proving that God exists does not automatically make claims about God true. Let's have our erstwhile opposition take a different position for the time being.
Mermaids are real.
Well, there certainly are a lot of stories about mermaids, and they happen in cultures spanning the globe. Of course, there's Hans Christian Andersen's famous story of the Little Mermaid. There's the story of the goddess Atargatis from 1000 BC. Legend has it that Alexander the Great's sister, Thessaloniki, was turned into a mermaid. There's the Babylonian god Enki, Julinar from the 1001 Arabian Nights, the Benveri from the Isle of Man. They're in legends from China and Africa. The people of Guam still tell the story of Starina, the first mermaid. The Caribbeans, La Sirene. Blackbeard himself reported seeing them, as did many others. And yet, there isn't the first piece of evidence that they actually exist, aside from a few badly done hoaxes.
But you don't know. Mermaids could be out there. There could be evidence for them someday.
Maybe. Suppose that happened right now. What would that mean? We know that the information we have about mermaids up to this point is just made-up stories and fabrications. Could we trust any of them to be correct?
Well, some of them might be.
But how would we know? We'd have to study the mermaids independently and see. And if any of them were right, they would have been right only by luck. It would not confirm that any of them had any actual knowledge of mermaids, and we wouldn't be able to use any of them to make predictions about what real mermaids are like.
Okay, can I stop believing in mermaids now? I'm feeling a little silly.
Oh, and you didn't in the first 10 parts?
Ha ha ha.
Not to mention those big silly glasses.
Hey, you promised not to make fun of my glasses.
Oh, right, yeah. Sorry. Anyway, the point is, if we did find evidence for God, it wouldn't automatically make the Bible or any of the other books about him right. The universe would still be much older than 6,000 years, humans still wouldn't come from just 2 specimens, and there still wouldn't have been a global flood. We still would have evolved from a common ancestral population, the universe would still have formed in the Big Bang, and so on. Simply finding God would not overturn any of that. The evidence is still the evidence. And yet, just like with the mermaid stories, we wouldn't be able to use any of those religious texts to make predictions about what God is like. But more than that, all of these followers of all of these religions would just use the discovery as an excuse to shore up their defenses.
See, we were right and you atheists were wrong.
Yes, in that case, we would have been wrong as a question of fact. But since the religious people would all be using this as confirmation for everything they believe, they wouldn't be in any position to know what God is really like. In that case, it's actually the atheists, or rather the now former atheists, who would be in a much better position to study him. There wouldn't be any preconceived notions or biases to overcome. Once we accepted the existence of God, we'd be able to study his true nature, and would still have to fight the religious people tooth and nail. So there is every possibility that we are wrong, but even if that were the case, that still wouldn't make religion right. And even if it could, there's still the question of which religion. Not only that, But even if you could prove Christianity right in one aspect, that doesn't automatically make it right about everything else. Maybe Christianity is right about one thing, Islam is right about another, and Buddhism is right about a third. You don't get to do this all or nothing proposal. There's just no defense for it. As for libertarianism, what would it mean for a libertarian to be wrong?
Hey, look! I found one thing the state can do that no one else can.
What would that mean? Well, it means that we found a problem, the only solution to which is to give a monopoly group the power to initiate force. So?
That means we're right.
Actually, no, it doesn't. Okay, you found one problem we need a state to solve. But just like with religion, it doesn't automatically make you right about the rest. The evidence is still the evidence. Minimum wage would still result in unemployment instead of the poor getting an instant raise. It would still be wrong for the NSA to spy on us. And prohibition still wouldn't work and would only create a violent criminal black market. None of that would have changed. And yet, when we tear apart something the state does, you still come back with,
but who would build the roads?
Even if you were able to prove that only the state can make roads, that still wouldn't mean that minimum wage is good, or only the state can fight fires, or they can just pass a law and get us all off drugs. And besides, how would you prove this? As long as the state is the default, as long as you get to just unilaterally declare legitimate intrusions into this area, you've proved nothing, because you haven't given anyone else the chance to try anything else. And remember, that's all libertarians want. Give us the option to try other solutions. And if it is true that only the state can do this or that, then no one else will even be able to offer another alternative. So why all this monopolization? What are you afraid of? No, even if you could prove we can only build roads by force, that doesn't mean that other policies and programs must be implemented by force. And it certainly wouldn't mean that the same group of people had to do it. See, just like with religion, you don't get to do an all or nothing proposal. Even if it's true that we need to use force to build the roads and fight fires, that doesn't mean that the same entity, your state, must do both. Why can't one group of people build roads and a completely different group of people fight fires? So even if you can prove us wrong, you've still got a long way to go towards justifying your state. We're perfectly willing to be shown wrong. But remember that not only is the burden of proof on you, but that simply countering that one proposal is not enough to confirm all of your claims. Now it's your turn. What if you're wrong? Here's another problem that's common to both religion and government. Since both set up supreme authorities, you have a problem of how you know to trust the authority and what happens if something goes wrong. It all boils down to a phrase from the ancient Roman poet and political satirist Decimus Juvenalis, quis custodiet ipsos custodes, or who watches the watchman? Let's start with the most obvious example, Catholicism.
You're not supposed to read the Bible yourself. Anything you need to know about it, your priest will tell you.
Yes, people to this day are taught this in Catholic churches and schools. But this sets up a classic problem of who watches the watchman? What happens when the priest says something that's wrong?
They can't. They're men of God.
So what if they tell you something like evolution is false and we all came from Adam and Eve?
Then it must be true.
But the science says it isn't.
Science doesn't know everything.
Oh, but priests do?
Sure, they're men of God.
And so, you set up an authority that is supreme, that cannot be countermanded. Which can be a big problem if those very same priests start molesting choir boys. But it's not just Catholicism. It's pretty much all religion. There's a supreme authority, a preacher or a rabbi or an imam or whatever. Or there's a text from God that absolutely cannot be wrong, like the Bible or the Quran or the Book of Mormon. We've already covered this back in part 3. How do you know you've selected the right one? But this goes above that. Claiming that there even is one is the problem. Because the moment you have the supreme authority, the moment you have a central dogma that cannot be overturned, you're lost. This is what leads to hatred and bigotry. And when a bunch of people with two different supreme authorities come together, there really isn't much choice other than to have a war. We covered the argument for morality in Part 8, but again, this is a level above it. By even claiming that there is a supreme moral authority, you get problems like how your wife should be subservient to you.
Well, that's what the Bible says.
But what if that's not the way it should be? What if the wife and husband should be equals?
But that's not what the Bible says.
See, there's no way out of it. What about when God told Abraham to kill Isaac?
That was a faith test.
No, a faith test would be something like walking on hot coals or crossing a rickety bridge. That test is a test to see if someone is a psychopathic killer.
But God told him to do it.
But how do we check to see if God was right to do it?
God is above such checks. He's automatically right.
And that's the problem. God is an authority that cannot be countermanded. So anything he says, even kill your own son, becomes something you have to do. Because there's no one who watches the watchman. If anyone comes around and tells you that it's wrong, then they got something incorrect. You can't listen to them. You can't consider what they say, because nothing can go against the holy text or the priest. And so, if your son comes out to you as gay, even if you saw the signs of it long before puberty, you have to believe it's a choice, and that it's a horrible thing. You have to chastise your own son, because not even the love a parent feels for a child, love that is supposed to be free and unconditional, can countermand the supreme authority. It's the power to question these edicts, these commandments, that has led us to progress to the point where you don't have to follow the words of priests. Women don't have to be subservient to their husbands, and psychopaths don't have to murder their children just because a voice in their heads tells them to. Juvenal's original satire where he used this phrase referred to the absurdity of enforcing morality on another. A man who is to wed wants to make sure his wife will be faithful. His friends tell him to lock her in the house and keep guards on her. He points out that someone will have to guard those guards, and then someone will have to guard those guards, and at some point you'll have to terminate the sequence. Whereupon the wife just skips all the middlemen and bribes the guards at the top. No matter how you set it up, there's always that single point of failure. And if it's problematic for an authority to be above people with religion, how much more so is it with the state?
We need government to keep us in line.
Well, who keeps government in line? And that's the problem. The best answer they have, such as it is in the case of democracy. Who keeps government in line?
The people do.
But I thought government kept the people in line.
They do.
So how does that work? Again, you have to terminate the sequence. But the minute you do that, you have problems.
We need the state to make us behave.
Debunked in Part 8.
Well then, how would you do it?
Part 5.
But government works for the good of the people.
Part 7.
But government's just different.
Part 2. Look, no matter what your excuse is, you just can't change the fact that you're giving government supreme authority. Authority that cannot be countermanded.
But government's there to protect us.
And what happens if they don't?
Oh, don't be paranoid. What are you worried about? FEMA camps?
You don't need jackboots and concentration camps for this to be a major problem. It can happen on an individual level and be just as bad. Kelly Thomas was a homeless man who suffered from schizophrenia. Cops with the Fullerton County Police Department in California were caught on camera, video and audio, beating him to death. Why? Because he wouldn't comply with their orders, even though it's clear he didn't understand, and he even asked for clarification. They beat him, tased him, and kicked him while he begged for mercy. He died later in the hospital. And none of these cops paid the price. If you or I did anything like that, we'd be in prison, probably for life. But these guys are home with their families and enjoying their pensions.
But that's just an isolated incident.
So what? These isolated incidences happen all the time, and very rarely are the police held to any degree of accountability for what they've done. It's easy to see the tyranny when they're segregating schools or putting people on blacklists or herding people with slanted eyes into concentration camps. When it happens one at a time like that, it's much harder. But as long as there's no one to watch the watchmen, they'll continue to do it and continue to get away with it. Every week there are more and more stories like this. Rare is the story where one of these cops serves any jail time. And it's the same story when, for example, the NSA spies on people without a warrant, or the president sends drones to kill people he thinks might be terrorists.
Well, we need government reforms to stop this.
Really? Like what?
A congressional oversight committee?
Really?
Okay.
The fact is, no matter what you do to try and put in some kind of review or checks and balances or whatever, as long as there are some people who have power over others, this will always happen. The only way out of it is to say that no one in government can do anything that will be illegal for a citizen to do, and that citizens have just as much legitimacy in protecting themselves and others from violence as the police do, even when the person committing the violence is a policeman. And if we do that, we won't need watchmen. Stay tuned. Welcome to part 13 of our series showing the common fallacies of theism and statism. In this edition, we'll cover a very common fallacy called the No True Scotsman fallacy. It goes something like this. No Scotsman ever puts sugar on his porridge! Well, my friend Hamish is a Scotsman, and he puts sugar on his porridge. If he puts sugar on his porridge, then he's nae a true Scotsman. Fear my attack eyebrows! So the No True Scotsman fallacy is just an ad hoc way of dismissing contradictory data. The counterexample isn't properly dealt with. It isn't said why it's an exception, nothing is done to show that it doesn't properly fit the category, and it's certainly not the case that the person revises his claim or admits that he's wrong. Attack eyebrows! Now it's not a fallacy if the person isn't actually a Scotsman. I wasn't born in Scotland. I'm not a citizen of Scotland. I've never even been to Scotland. So it wouldn't be fallacious at all for Scotty McEyebrows there to say I'm not a Scotsman. I'm not. So if the person can be shown to be objectively not Scottish before the claim is even made, then it's not fallacious. It's only when someone who fits the definition of a Scotsman, someone born or living in Scotland, is excluded solely because he doesn't fit the claim being made. Eyebrows! One of the most prominent ways we're seeing this with religion is with Muslim extremists engaging in terrorist attacks. So, dumb glasses, how about putting on your Muslim hat and telling us what Islam has to say about this?
A Muslim hat? You mean like a turban? I don't want to do that. That's offensive.
Yeah, I was being metaphorical.
Oh, okay. Because I don't want to wear the hat. These glasses are bad enough.
Hey, at least I didn't make you wear the attack eyebrows.
True.
So, lay the Muslim claim on us.
Islam is a religion of peace. Those people who committed those attacks weren't true Muslims.
But they say they are, and they quote the Quran for support. Look, I understand you wanting to disassociate yourself from them, but the proper way to do that is to point out that you shouldn't judge all Muslims for the actions of a very tiny few. That's guilt by association, which is also fallacious. Besides, those same extremists say that they're the real Muslims, the ones doing what Allah commanded in the Quran. How do we tell who's right? It happens with Christianity too.
Those who support legalized abortion aren't true Christians.
But I thought Christian just meant someone who believed in the Lord Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and the abortion thing.
Or even...
Christ taught us to love all people, even homosexuals. No, he didn't. Homosexuality is an abomination. No, it isn't. You're not a true Christian. No, you're not the true Christian. No, you're not. No, you're not.
Guys! We get the idea, okay? How about this one?
Once you're a Christian, you can't become an atheist.
But we've got lots of atheists who used to be Christians.
Well, they weren't really Christians.
You also get things like this. What about all the passages in the Bible that condone and support slavery?
That wasn't real slavery.
What do you mean it wasn't real slavery?
Well, it wasn't chattel slavery of people of a different race from a different continent, was it?
No, of course it wasn't in the category of slavery you've just narrowly defined as to specifically exclude all the forms of slavery the Bible does condone. What do you think that proves? Now, in fairness, we sometimes see this with atheists too.
You're not an atheist if you believe in psychic powers. You're not a real atheist if you're a Republican. If you're an atheist, you have to be a feminist.
Well, no. Atheism just means you don't believe in any god or gods. So everyone is prone to this. But it's wrong when anyone does it. Just like in politics.
If you're against the war on terror, then you're. If you're against NSA surveillance, then you're. If you're against collective bargaining, then you're. If you support the Koch brothers, then you're un-American!
Wow. The fallacy namer had to do with someone of a country, Scotland, and they do it with a country, America. No true American agrees with the things that I hate. You can take my eyebrows, but you can never take my freedom! Let's break it down by political party.
If you're against anything Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or John Kerry have done, you're a dino, a Democrat in name only.
Or on the other side,
if you want to legalize drugs or bring the troops home, you're a rhino, a Republican in name only.
But these are political parties, defined solely by people who have registered as one or the other. So what way is there to be a Democrat or Republican other than by name? And again, in fairness, we see libertarians do this too.
You're not a real libertarian if you're minarchist. You're not a real libertarian if you're an anarchist.
When a libertarian could be either one. But there is one big difference with libertarians. We do have a definition outside mere party affiliation. A libertarian is someone who abides by the non-aggression principle. So if someone commits, condones, or advocates an act that's an initiation of force, we can say that he's not being a true libertarian at that moment. But you can only do that if you have a defining principle that lets you know who is and isn't a libertarian before the act in question. In debates between statists and libertarians, this mostly manifests itself when libertarians point out the failure of big government. So to a socialist, we might point out the failure of the Soviet Union.
But that wasn't real socialism.
The thing is, before the Soviet Union collapsed, socialists all over the world were pointing to it as an example of the success of socialism. Finally, here was a true socialist state, and it was one of the world's biggest superpowers. What a success story! Economist Paul Samuelson even made this claim in many editions of his textbook. Then, the Soviet Union collapses and...
Well, that wasn't real socialism.
But before you were saying it was. Why are you now saying it wasn't?
Because it collapsed. Real socialism wouldn't have collapsed.
Well, what about Afghanistan, Cambodia, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Somalia?
Nope, not real socialism.
If you ever claim that socialism was never really tried because all of these numerous examples of socialism weren't real socialism, then you have nothing to say against a Christian apologist who says the slavery in the Bible wasn't real slavery. There's no difference. There's no legitimacy whatsoever in denying that Somalia was socialist before its collapse any more than there is in claiming it became libertarian after its collapse, as we discussed in Part 9. You can't worm out of it by special pleading like we discussed in Part 2. And you can't get around it by redefining or cherry-picking or narrowing the category. Even when atheists and libertarians have employed the no-truth-Scotsman fallacy, it hasn't been about anything as deeply systemic as it is with religion and statism. And when you have to keep resorting to it when dealing with issues as fundamental as the ones we've discussed here, how can you say you have any logical reason to believe your position? Stay tuned. But I don't want my freedom. Welcome to the next fallacy that's encountered by both atheists and libertarians alike. You know, it's one thing to be involved in a discussion where the other person is making fallacious arguments. It's another thing entirely when they make outright threats, no matter how much they distance themselves from the act of actually carrying out the threat. What's worse is that they make it sound like they're doing you a favor. I'm here to make you an offer you can't refuse. So you're just sitting around your home, minding your own business, when some Nimrod with a Bible shows up at your door. That's a really nice life you got here. It'd be a real shame if you went to hell when it's over.
Went to hell? I don't want to go to hell.
Hey, these things happen, you know what I'm saying? There's these rules. It's kind of a long list, but it's obvious-like stuff, you know what I'm saying? Like, what do we got here? Don't steal, don't kill, don't do no drugs, don't do no gambling, don't do no gay stuff, don't have no graven images, don't wear wool with linen, and, oh yeah, don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk.
Oh no, I boiled a baby goat in its mother's milk just last week. What can I do?
Tell you what, give us 10% of your paycheck as a tithe, and we'll make sure you don't go to hell. Oh, and there's some bowing and scraping and genuflecting as well. Do all that, and we'll put in a good word for you with the G-Man upstairs. We'll make sure you get to heaven. Hey, it's a bargain if you think about it.
Gee, thanks.
Would anyone actually think this is a good thing if they hadn't been deliberately indoctrinated into believing it? And what happens when you do begin to come to your senses and decide to try living your life a different way? You didn't pay your tithes. You didn't bow and scrape. You started believing in evolution and science and the Big Bang and all that stuff, and didn't worship Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. That means you're going to hell. G-Man gonna throw you in a place where bad things will happen to yous. How is this any different than a protection racket? You didn't pay your protection money, so we gotta break your legs. And even worse, they'll blame the bad consequences on you. Why are you making God do that, huh? It's your fault because you didn't do the worshiping. I really hates it when people makes God do that. So, God makes up these unjust rules, punishes you when you disobey these rules, but gives you a loophole to avoid punishment for breaking the unjust rules that he just made up to begin with. And that all of a sudden makes it just? It would be one thing if these people were saying,
Look, just do what he says. I know it's wrong, but I don't want to see you get hurt.
But no, they say,
He's a just and all-loving God, and the moral thing to do is to obey him.
the moral and just thing to do is to stand up against the oppressor and say, no, I will not. The mafioso doesn't have the right to break my legs, and God doesn't have the right to send me to hell. And if he judges me by such hideously immoral standards and delivers such cruel and unusual punishment as a result, then he's nothing but a two-bit tyrant. And if he does exist, he should be opposed by every moral and decent person everywhere. Of course, there's absolutely no evidence that he does exist, but sadly, this isn't true of the state. That's really the big difference between the atheist and the libertarian positions here. Libertarians are standing up against people who actually have the power to deliver on their threats. That's a really nice home you got here. It'd be a shame if, someone were to kick you out of it.
You're right. I need someone to protect me from criminals.
Tell you what, give us 10% of your paycheck in taxes and we'll make sure nothing happens to yous or your home. It's a bargain if you think about it.
Gee, thanks.
But just like religion, you gotta read the fine print. Course, we got some rules, kind of a long list, but it's obvious stuff, you know, like, what do we got here? Don't steal, don't kill, don't do no drugs, don't do no gambling, don't have no guns without no appointment, don't open no lemonade stands, don't feed the homeless, don't have no big gulp, don't compete with health insurance companies, oh, and don't have fake testicles hanging from your trunk. There's some more, about 80,000 pages, but that's the gist of it.
Sorry, I just had to go take the fake testicles off my trunk.
And what happens if you refuse? You didn't pay your taxes. That means we gotta take you home. Maybe even throw you in a place where bad things'll happen to yous. Again, would anyone think this is a good thing if they hadn't been deliberately indoctrinated into believing it? Just like with religion, it's no different than a protection racket. Why you making the state do that, huh? It's your fault because you didn't pay your taxes. I really hates it when people makes the government do that. So, like God, the state can just make up whatever unjust rules they want and punish you when you disobey those rules. But unlike religion, the state doesn't even give you a loophole to avoid punishment for breaking the unjust rules that they just made up to begin with. And like religion, it would be one thing if statists were saying,
Look, just do what he says. I know it's wrong, but I don't want to see you get hurt.
But no. Just like religion, they say it's a good thing and it's your fault for not complying. The state is worse than religion, because the bad place they'll send you to is very, very real. And even if you genuinely did do something wrong, like rob someone, as opposed to something harmless and arbitrary like smoke marijuana or buy insurance from out of state, the place they send you to is not a place where you'll be rehabilitated. Just the opposite. It's a place of violence, which you'll come out of with a lot of psychological damage. Moreover, the state is actually worse than the mafia. At least if something happens and you call the mafia, they respond. Hey, you with the mafia now. We'll take care of yous, no worries. Bada boom, bada bing. But if you call the police? Hey, sorry, but there's this court case, Warren vs. DC, says we ain't gotta protect yous. So maybe we will, maybe we won't. Depends what we feel like. Oh, but we still gets to take your money. By the way, Congress raised the tax rate. Pay up. So you might be able to get a better deal with the mob. Yeah, and we don't even got no rule against gambling. You wanna gamble? We'll set yous up, bada boom, bada bing.
Oh, now you're not being fair. With government, we have a voice. We can vote.
Yeah, vote. That's right. Yous can vote. Here's yous candidates, Guido and Nunzio. Yous can vote for whichever one yous want to makes the rules and breaks your fingers when you don't obey.
Well, why can't someone else run for office?
They can, but they ain't in the mob, know what I'm saying? So they'll have to get, 100,000 signatures. Yeah, that seems fair. And then they don't get to raise no money because of campaign finance reform, whilst Guido and Nunzio get free press. Also, they won't get in no debates. Debates will be Guido versus Nunzio. We gotta do that. Protects the ballot from clutter. Ain't it nice that you got us to make these decisions for yous? No, it's nothing more than religious apologetics to excuse this crap with things like the social contract or who will build the roads or you can just vote. The moral and just thing to do is to stand up against the oppressor and say, no, I will not. He doesn't have the right to break my legs. He doesn't have the right to send me to jail for having a few ounces of a plant. And if he judges me by such hideously immoral standards and delivers such cruel and unusual punishment as a result, then he's nothing but a 2-bit tyrant. And since this government absolutely does exist, it should be opposed by every moral and decent person everywhere. Hey, I'm with you there. I don't even pay no taxes. Hey, me neither. Me neither too. In fact, I get taxpayers paying my pension for life. At least with religion, their threats don't have much teeth. Once you realize there's no reason to believe your immortal soul even exists, and if it does, there's no reason to believe it's any danger of hellfire damnation, you're automatically free. Unless the religion happens to be the government as well where you are, once you leave them, there's nothing they can do to you. Not so with the state. Just like the mob, they can force you into compliance. They can make up whatever rules they want, give you the illusion of choice and participation and democracy, and punish you however they want as a result. Earlier this year, they sentenced a man to life in prison for running an e-commerce site in a part of the internet that was beyond their ability to regulate and tax. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics from the U.S. Department of Justice, the average sentence for violent homicide in the U.S. is 149 months, just over 12 years. And on average, they only served half that time, 12 years, out in 6, for murder. Run an unregulated e-commerce site, life without parole. This is not justice. This is a criminal mob protecting their turf. And just like with religion, completely arbitrary rules and hideously unjust punishment become the completely justified rules of a beneficent authority in the poisoned mind of the true believers. With religion, you can just stop believing. With the state, it's going to take more. We need an awakening of the people to the horror of the authoritarianism around them. Bada boom, bada bing! Welcome to another video in our series about the common fallacies and tactics committed by adherents of the dogma of religion and the dogma of the state. And this is something referred to as the statement of conversion fallacy. Basically, here's someone who used to be on your side who isn't anymore.
Here's someone who used to be an atheist, now he's a Christian. What do you have to say to that?
Really? Do you have any idea what a yawn that is for us? I mean, it happens all the time on our side. We have atheist after atheist after atheist who used to be Christian or Jewish or Muslim or whatever. Someone says they used to be religious but are now atheist. We say, cool, we should hang out sometime. But what do religious people do when they get a convert from atheism?
Yay! We got one! We got one! Whoopee! Let's take him around. Get him in churches. Get him on TV. Get him a book deal. We finally got one!
You know what that says to us? It says that it is such a rare event for an atheist to convert to a religion that you have to seize on that unique opportunity. Whereas on our side, it happens so often that running into an atheist that used to be religious is a commonplace occurrence. So think about that next time you want to push this person in our faces, as if it somehow proves you were correct all along. We have a lot more examples of people converting our way. So maybe you don't really want to play that game, huh? Just a bit of advice. What's more interesting is when we run into the person who says that they personally used to be an atheist, but it's something like this.
I used to be an atheist because I hated God and wanted to sin.
No, people aren't atheists for those reasons. If you tell us that you used to be an atheist, and for the reasons why, you run down the tired old list of straw man arguments for why people are atheists that no one who wasn't already on your side believed for a second, then don't be surprised when we doubt that you were ever really an atheist after all. We see it with related subjects like evolution.
I used to be an evolutionist until I found out I was lied to. Then I found God.
Pro tip, people who accept evolution as scientifically valid don't call themselves an evolutionist, or Darwinist, or any of the other monikers you put on us. We We don't really have a word for a person who believes in evolution. We accept gravity too, but we don't say we're gravitationists or Newtonists. If you want us to believe that you accepted evolution, you have to demonstrate that you actually know something about it. Don't give us all the long debunked crap from creationist talking points like how evolution is a dog giving birth to a cat, or how it violates the second law of thermodynamics, or whatever. Again, if you do that, don't be surprised if we don't believe for 1 second that you ever accepted evolution. Why on earth would you people think that just making up the fact that you used to be on our side would be persuasive? Even if it is true, it actually tells you nothing about whether or not evolution is true. The scientific evidence does that. Also, this is another case where the fact that there's more than one religion comes back to bite you. One atheist converts to Christianity, and this is proof that Christianity is correct. Another atheist converts to Islam, and this is proof that Islam is correct. But how can they both be true? And then you have the tug of war of Christians converting to Islam, Muslims converting to Christianity. How can conversion be any kind of evidence when there are all of these contradictory conclusions to draw from it? No, this is just another argument from self-authority. But there is one point that religion has over the state here. They can actually point to verifiable examples of proper atheists converting to Christianity. They've even got a Wikipedia page for that. Statists don't seem to be able to do that. They don't point to a libertarian on the order of Murray Rothbard or Harry Brown giving up their libertarianism and converting to statism. If that ever happened, then for whatever reason, the statists are keeping it secret. Oh, but there are no shortages of individual statists who claim that they used to be libertarians, and like the religious people who claim to be atheists or evolutionists, it just doesn't ring true.
I used to be a libertarian, but then I learned to care about others. I used to be a libertarian, but then I grew up. I used to be a libertarian back when I was selfish. I used to be a libertarian, but then I went to college and learned reality.
And you really think that this is supposed to convince us? Or how about this?
I used to be a libertarian, but then some libertarians were mean to me.
Really? That's the criteria you use to find out the truth? Who's mean to you? And like religion, we run into stuff like this.
I was a libertarian because I believed in social Darwinism.
When, if anything, social Darwinism is the antithesis of libertarianism. There's all sorts of crazy things like this one, almost verbatim from Salon.com.
I was a libertarian back when I had a limited vision of the future.
Or this one, again almost verbatim from Salon.
I was a libertarian because I thought that selfishness and cruelty were fantastic personality traits.
Or this one, almost verbatim from Salon. Wow, a lot of these guys are on Salon, aren't they?
I was a libertarian until I realized knee-jerk anti-government sentiment was not a viable political philosophy.
Oh? Well, good thing that's not what libertarianism is! So again, don't be surprised if we think you're just cooking this up as a lame attempt to convince us of what? Again, why should we be convinced by conversion and not by facts or rational argumentation? And you also have the same problem as the religious, of there being more than one political philosophy.
I used to be a libertarian, but now I'm a liberal. I used to be a libertarian, but now I'm a conservative.
Okay, so which is correct, liberal or conservative?
I used to be a liberal, but then I grew a brain and became a conservative. I used to be a conservative, but then I grew a heart and became a liberal.
See? It doesn't work. There's no consistent conclusion that argument from conversion can point to. I have something to say to both the theist and the statist. I did used to be on your side. There was a time when I was a very devout Christian. There was also a time when I thought government could solve our problems. I believed in a lot of the causes of progressive liberals. I was a big advocate of the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example. So in both of these issues, I am a convert. But have any of you ever seen me use that as an argument? Rational people aren't convinced by other people's conversion. Religious people are. And that's the real issue here. Christians try to convince us by trotting out converted atheists because that's what will convince them. And by the same token, statists pull this "I used to be libertarian" crap because, being no less dogmatic than the Christians, that's what will convince them. And the fact that it doesn't convince us is taken as just more proof that we're unthinking automatons blindly marching in lockstep with each other. But if it's fallacious reasoning, and it is, then no rational person should be convinced by that. And we aren't. And the ones who would expect us to be, therefore cannot be rational. The conclusion's pretty obvious, isn't it? Stay tuned. Welcome to another video covering a common fallacy committed by both statists and religious fundamentalists alike. For this one, we're going to have to start off going back in time about 250 years to before the founding of our country.
No taxation without representation.
It was the cry that led a revolution. Since tax money is taken by force, and Parliament decided how much to tax the colonists, they said their taxes were illegitimate because they didn't have any representatives in Parliament to argue for their interests. In 1764, a man named Thomas Whately attempted to legitimize these taxes by arguing for what he called virtual representation. He said that, even though the colonists weren't directly represented in Parliament, they were virtually represented. Members of Parliament would debate these taxes and only vote for them after deciding that they were in the best interests of the colonies. George Granville directly said that this meant that Parliament's taxes on the colonies were justified. Obviously, that didn't go over so well in the colonies, but despite the fact that it had a lot of opposition, even among the British people as well, Parliament asserted the validity of virtual representation in the Declaratory Act of 1776. William Pitt stood up in Parliament to protest. It is my opinion that this kingdom has no right to lay a tax upon the colonies. There is an idea in some that the colonies are virtually represented in the House. I would fain know by whom an American is represented here. Is he represented by any knight of the shire in any county in this kingdom? Would to God that respectable representation was augmented to a greater number. Or will you tell him that he is represented by any representative of a borough which perhaps its own representatives never saw? This is what is called the rotten part of the Constitution. It cannot continue a century. If it does not drop, it must be amputated. It all came to a head with the Stamp Act. The Revolution was born, and the rest is history. And that history has come down pretty fully on the side of the rejection of virtual representation. So what does this have to do with religion? It all ties in with original sin. And I don't mean the original sin fallacy. We'll cover that elsewhere in this series. No, I mean the claim of Judeo-Christian Islamic religions that we are all judged as sinners from the moment we are born, before we had a chance to behave any other way. Why?
Because a talking snake told a lady to eat an apple, and Adam did so too, and thereby disobeyed God.
But that's Adam doing that, not any of us. Why are we held responsible for his actions? Here's the answer, verbatim, from William Lane Craig. Adam represents us before God, just as in, say, the U.S. Congress, your federal representative represents you. He votes for you. We don't have a democracy in which all of us can go and vote. Rather, we have a representative system whereby our representative votes in our place. All persons are culpable for what Adam does. He votes on our behalf, and we are held responsible for it. Therefore, all persons are born sinners, and therefore they will inevitably sin. Sin is not just a sort of accident that befalls us. We are sinful by nature, and therefore inevitably will sin. Of course, the first thing anyone with any brains thinks is, but I didn't vote for Adam. I didn't even get a chance to select him as my representative. I wasn't even born then. Craig has an answer for this. We cannot complain that we have been misrepresented by Adam before God. Adam has faithfully represented us before God, and therefore we cannot complain about what Adam did. So it doesn't matter that we didn't get to vote for him. Adam represented us anyway. Virtual representation. How is damnation without representation any better than taxation without representation? And speaking of taxation without representation, which is what this was all about originally anyway, did we really eliminate that?
Sure we did. You can vote for your representative, and he votes on whether or not to raise taxes.
Are you sure?
Look, you're obviously going to shoot down what I just said, so just get on with it.
All right. Consider deficit spending. Who pays the taxes to cover that?
We do.
Well, not really. The debt is paid for with future taxation.
Okay, so?
So people are going to be taxed to pay off today's debt for another 30 years.
Okay, so?
You really don't see it. All right, I'll spell it out for you. Would someone who's 10 years old today have to pay taxes to cover the debt until he's 40?
Well, of course.
Even though he didn't get to vote? He didn't get to vote for a single congressman or senator or the president or anyone who had any say into whether or not this debt was incurred.
Well, no.
Okay, so he's required to pay taxes because of legislative actions by people who don't represent him. In fact, people who aren't even born yet will be taxed to pay it off. Even if we stopped increasing the debt right now, children will be forced to pay taxes even if they won't be born for another 12 years. As soon as they turn 18, they'll have to pay the taxes on this debt to pay for the things government is spending money on today. Taxation without representation.
No, that just isn't it, and I'll tell you why.
By the way, these next few arguments are verbatim from statists on my Facebook page.
Obviously, children can't vote. Nevertheless, their representatives in the government have a duty to represent their interests, and not just the interests of those who can vote.
Isn't that virtual representation again?
Oh, but what's the alternative? You don't want them to be able to borrow money, because then people who can't vote yet will have to pay taxes to pay those debts. But how is this different from any other decision current representatives have to make that will, in the future, affect those who cannot currently vote?
Because those decisions can be repealed by future Congresses. They can't repeal future debt payments.
The point of loans is to prevent increasing taxes now.
So then it's better to increase taxes later on people who have no say about it?
Well, we can always pay it off early.
But they're not required to. And it's not like the children or the unborn can threaten to vote them out of office if they don't. The whole point is that they can't vote yet.
Their parents can do it for them.
Again, virtual representation. Actually, this is virtual representation twice removed. Their parents, representatives they didn't get to vote for, select the representatives they still didn't get to vote for who raised their taxes. How is this better?
Of course, the people can always demand a debt-linked limit law.
What people? Not the ones who aren't old enough to vote yet. Again, you're saying it's valid because someone else can act on their behalf. Someone they didn't get to choose as their representative. It's virtual representation, no different than the arguments we covered earlier from Thomas Whately and William Lane Craig.
The idea that I borrowed any ideas from fundamentalists is silly. No reason for insults.
I didn't insult you. I'm pointing out that you're using the same bogus argument as Craig did. Statists always pull this crap, as we've seen throughout this series. Point out they committed the same fallacy as creationists, and you get...
Mommy, the bad man called me a creationist.
Statists never want to admit the blatant fallacies they commit. It's like Alexis de Tocqueville said, expenses will always be considerable, either because taxes cannot touch those who vote for them, or because they are assessed in a way to prevent that. He also said, a democratic government is the only one in which those who vote for a tax can escape the obligation to pay it. How dare anyone vote for a tax that someone else who didn't get to vote will have to pay? And especially when it's their own children that they're saddling with debt. Also, they can have what they want today. Oh, but it's the libertarians who are selfish and greedy. Stay tuned. Welcome to yet another fallacy committed by both statists and the religious. You know, when I started this series, I really hoped to be able to engage in a rational dialogue with atheist skeptics who aren't libertarians. So far, they've completely resisted this, resorting to the same fallacies and tactics I've been pointing out, and engaging in the very same sort of ad hominem and poisoning the well attacks they complain about others doing. It'd be nice if they showed a little bit of self-awareness here, but this is an important series pointing out vital concepts, so soldier on we must. This one is about the original sin fallacy. With religion, this is distinct from the dogma of original sin, which states that after the fall, we are all born sinful and therefore need to be saved. No, this is a different but related fallacy where the religious person says,
Without God, what would stop you from killing and raping a bunch of people?
It's similar to the argument from morality we covered in Part 8, but in this case, it has to do with what the claimant says is the very nature of humanity itself. It can be summarized as,
How can you be good without God?
Here's an example from Ray Comfort.
Do you think you're a good person?
Sure, for the most part. I'm not perfect, but yeah, I'd say I'm a good person.
Have you ever told a lie?
Well, yeah, hasn't everybody at some point? Even if it's back in their childhood?
Then doesn't that make you a liar?
Really? This is supposed to be some kind of knockdown argument? Lying even at one point in your life makes you a liar? I fixed my sink one time. Does that make me a plumber? Not that Ray Comfort has shown any compunction about lying over and over again about what atheists say and believe, but I guess he's saved, so that doesn't matter. At any rate, by Comfort's logic, if you've done even one good thing in your life, then that makes you a good person. So it's completely self-defeating. But religions all over the world depend on the concept of humans being inherently selfish and evil, and therefore in need of being saved by some outside force. It's like you're infected with some kind of disease, and hey, what do you know? Our religion has the cure. This pervades the Abrahamic religions.
It was because Adam sinned, and we all became inherently evil after that.
Even if they don't take it literally, it's...
Genesis is a metaphor, but it describes how we're all inherently evil and need to be saved.
And what's the point of all this?
That God is awesome and will forgive us anyway.
We see this all the time with professional athletes. When they win, it's...
Thank you, God, for the win. You made my feet swift and brought our team to victory.
But when they lose, do they ever say,
Hey, did you see that part in the third quarter when Jesus made me fumble?
everything good we do is due to external forces, i.e. God, but everything bad we do is all us. What's interesting about this is most rational atheists consider themselves to be humanists, which is about exalting human beings, not making them out to be inherently evil. But as soon as you start talking about politics, all of a sudden, people become inherently evil again.
If we had anarchy, everyone would go around killing each other.
Really? You actually think it would work the way it does in Mad Max?
Well, yeah. Mad Max is anarchy and Star Trek is socialism.
Maybe you shouldn't learn economics from pop culture fiction. Isn't it funny how, in the real world, socialism ends up being more like Somalia and Venezuela?
But that's not real socialism.
Oh, come on! We did No True Scotsman back in Part 13.
Oh, right. Sorry.
But they use this to denigrate libertarianism.
Libertarianism only works if people are good.
But if libertarians believe that everyone's good, why are we so insistent on the right to keep and bear arms? So anyway, you think people are inherently bad.
Of course.
So what should we do?
We need government, of course.
And who will be in this government?
Well, people, naturally.
The very same inherently bad people you're worried about to begin with? This is nothing but the original sin fallacy. People are inherently evil, and so they can't be trusted. Therefore, we can't have libertarianism. Steven Weinberg famously said, With or without religion, you'd have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. But for good people to do evil things, it takes religion. He was wrong. The biggest way to get good people to do evil is not religion, but government. R.J. Rummel posted figures in his book Death by Government that showed that, during the 20th century, governments all over the world murdered 262 million people. That's not in wars, that's not as capital punishment, that's not even atrocities they commit against foreigners. It's the outright murder of their own citizens, and not by corrupt actors in government, but in those implementing their policies. 262 million, not counting the 35 million killed in wars, revolutions, and violent conflicts. By comparison, there were only 9 million murders committed by private citizens in that same time period. No one holds a candle to government. How can they get away with it? That was one question people wanted an answer to in the Nuremberg trials. Hermann Goering supplied it to U.S. Army Captain Gustav Gilbert. Of course the people don't want war. Why would some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best that he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood. But, after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it's always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it's a democracy, a fascist dictatorship, or a parliament, or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked, and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to greater danger. It works the same way in any country. Nowadays, Americans range from blasé to enthusiastic support of the president using drones to bomb people, even children, in countries where we aren't even at war. Otherwise good people, driven to support evil solely because it's the leaders in government committing the atrocities. Robert Lefevre said, "If men are good, you don't need a government. If men are evil, you don't dare have one." But it seems that, even though people aren't inherently evil, you still don't dare have one. Stay tuned. Welcome to part 18 of this series, detailing the uncanny resemblances between religious and political woos, and sometimes they get amazing indeed. Case in point, how many times have you heard a creationist say,
"Evolution is just a theory"?
Let's nip this in the bud right now. According to the National Academy of Sciences, quote, "In everyday usage, theory often refers to a hunch or a speculation. When people say, 'I have a theory about why that happened,' they are often drawing a conclusion based on fragmentary or inconclusive evidence." The formal scientific definition of theory is quite different from the everyday meaning of the word. It refers to a comprehensive explanation of some aspect of nature that is supported by a vast body of evidence. They specifically defined 4 scientific terms: fact, hypothesis, law, and theory. Fact. In science, an observation that has been repeatedly confirmed and for all practical purposes is accepted as true. Truth in science, however, is never final, and what is accepted as a fact today may be modified or even discarded tomorrow. Hypothesis. A tentative statement about the natural world leading to deductions that can be tested. If the deductions are verified, the hypothesis is provisionally corroborated. If the deductions are incorrect, the original hypothesis is proved false and must be abandoned or modified. Hypotheses can be used to build more complex inferences and explanations. Law. A descriptive generalization about how some aspect of the natural world behaves under stated circumstances. Theory. In science, a well-substantiated explanation of some aspect of the natural world that can incorporate facts, laws, inferences, and tested hypotheses. So this idea that people seem to have that this unproven idea is a theory, and then when proven it becomes a fact, just isn't what the words mean in a scientific context. An unproven idea is a hypothesis, and a fact is a repeatable observation. Facts can be used to test hypotheses, and if those hypotheses survive repeated testing, then they can be elevated to theory. In science, theory is as big as it gets. Theories incorporate facts and laws and use the confirmed hypotheses to generate a descriptive and predictive model.
But how is evolution true if it's only a theory?
First off, there's nothing only about being a theory. Again, it's as good as it gets. But the reason why we know it's true is because the theory makes testable predictions, and those predictions have withstood 150 years worth of testing, from the fossil record to the genetic record, even the success of evolutionary computer algorithms.
But it's still a theory.
Yeah, well, so's gravity. So's the idea that the Earth goes around the sun.
Now you're just being silly.
No, I'm not. A theory is a model that we can use to explain part of the universe. The fact that the model works so well speaks to the underlying truth. The theory of evolution allows us to achieve a lot, from the development of new pharmaceuticals to the next generation of supercomputers. Just like the theory of gravity allows us to launch spaceships and design roller coasters. In each case, every new design is a confirmation of the theory. But woos of all kinds just have to deny that. And yes, that includes statists.
Economics is just a theory.
Yes, many of them actually do say that, including ones who chide creationists for doing the same thing.
But it's still a theory.
So, what reason do you have for going against it? Like the minimum wage, the disemployment effects are pretty much guaranteed under the law of supply and demand.
But that's just a theory.
What part of the theory do you think is wrong? That firms can hire more people at lower wages? Or that more people will seek jobs at higher wages? Because that's all you need for supply and demand to be not only true, but applicable to the job market. Sometimes they're aware enough to couch it in different language, like,
Libertarianism may work on paper, but...
How is this a refutation of anything? Are you telling me that it'd be more believable if it didn't work on paper? Or even worse?
Libertarianism, like communism or socialism, works well on paper, but...
Except that communism and socialism don't even work on paper. They're mathematically unsustainable. A theory basically is something that works on paper. If you're going to complain about something on that basis, all you're doing is saying it's just a theory.
Well, it is.
Look, you're just shifting the burden of proof. Remember that as the side wanting to use force to implement their policies, the statists have to prove their side. And economics is just a theory, or libertarianism just looks good on paper, doesn't do the first thing toward achieving that. Again, we're forced to wonder why you'd have to resort to these tactics if you really were convinced you're right. Stay tuned.